She had spent 2 years building a life around the certainty that she had been right to leave. The files were thorough, the timeline was airtight. She had done what she always did when a situation became untenable. She had gathered every piece of available evidence, organized it into irrefutable order, and made a decision she could defend in front of anyone who asked. She had been a forensic accountant long enough to know that the most dangerous lies were the ones built on real numbers. Take a genuine transaction, shift its context by 3 days, assign it a different counterparty, and suddenly a routine payment became a bribe. Suddenly an innocent man looked like exactly the kind of man she had convinced herself Stellan Voss was. She had not let herself consider the alternative. She had been busy. She had Theo to raise a career to rebuild after the emotional wreckage of that year, and a very practical need to stop waking up at 3 in the morning, thinking about the way Stellan had looked at her like she was the only problem he had ever genuinely wanted to solve. Now she was standing in the lobby of Voss Maritime's Boston headquarters with a briefcase full of subpoenas and a regulatory badge that gave her access to every financial record the company had produced in the last 4 years. The assignment was clean, the mandate was clear. She was here to find the fraud. What she was not supposed to find was Stellan Voss himself standing 15 feet away from her with his jacket over one arm and his phone to his ear, looking exactly as she remembered and absolutely nothing like the man she had decided he was. He looked up. The lobby went quiet in the particular way that lobbies do when something happens that the building itself does not know how to categorize. His eyes found hers, and Iris Callahan made the same mistake she always made when presented with evidence that contradicted her working theory. She stood very still and told herself she was ready for this. She was not ready for this. The morning had started with the kind of specific, competent optimism that Iris had learned to manufacture when the alternative was acknowledging how complicated everything had become. She had been on the 6:15 Amtrak from Philadelphia Coffee and hand files open on her laptop, running through the preliminary documentation that the Federal Maritime Commission had forwarded to her firm 3 weeks ago. The assignment had come through channels, as they always did, a call from her managing partner, a brief that described suspected financial irregularities at one of the country's largest private shipping conglomerates, a timeline that suggested the investigation needed someone with her particular skill set. Her particular skill set, forensic accounting with a specialization in corporate fraud, a reputation for finding hidden structures in financial documents the way other people found typos, and a professional history that did not include the words personal involvement anywhere in the file. The FMC had not known about the personal involvement. That was the thing she had been turning over during the 2-hour train ride, the thing that had kept her awake for 3 nights before she made the decision to take the assignment anyway. Either they had not known, or they had known and deemed it irrelevant, or they had known and decided it was useful in ways she had not yet determined. She was a forensic accountant. She thought in terms of what the evidence suggested, and the evidence suggested that her assignment to this particular investigation was either coincidence or design, and she had long since stopped believing in coincidence when money was involved. Voss Maritime occupied the top 4 floors of a glass and steel building at the edge of Boston Harbor. The kind of building that had been designed to look like it had grown there organically, as inevitable as the water it overlooked. The lobby was understated in the way that very expensive things often were: stone floors, high ceilings, a single piece of abstract sculpture that had probably cost more than Iris's apartment. The kind of place where power announced itself quietly in materials rather than volume. She had been here once before, not professionally, personally. 14 months of a relationship that had moved faster than anything she had previously allowed herself with a man who had learned to read her silences the way she read balance sheets. And she had told herself that the speed was not a warning sign, but evidence of a particular kind of recognition. She had been wrong about that. About several things. The woman at the front desk looked up as Iris approached, professional and pleasant, prepared to be helpful. Iris produced her credentials, the FMC badge, her firm's identification, the letter of engagement that gave her access to the financial records department, effective immediately, and watched the receptionist's pleasant expression shift into something more carefully neutral. "Of course, Ms. Callahan. We were expecting you. If you'll give me just a moment to call up to the CFO's office." "That won't be necessary." The voice came from the right. Iris did not startle. She was proud of this. She had trained herself out of visible reactions to unexpected stimuli sometime around age 19, when she had decided that being readable was a liability she could not afford, and the training had held for 13 years. It did not entirely hold now. Stellan Voss was standing near the elevators with his jacket folded over one arm and his phone halfway to his pocket, which meant he had just ended a call and had been walking toward the exit and had seen her and stopped. She could reconstruct the sequence precisely. She was very good at reconstruction. He was 40 months older than the last time she had seen him, which was a specific count she was aware of making. Even as she was aware that making it said something about her, she would prefer not to examine. He was wearing the same kind of suit he always wore, dark, precisely cut Italian, if she remembered correctly, and she did remember, because she had always paid more attention to details around him than she had been strictly comfortable with. His hair was the same pale blonde it had always been, and his eyes, when they found hers across the lobby, were the same gray that she had spent a considerable amount of energy trying to forget. He did not look surprised. That was the first thing she noticed before the composure and the stillness and the particular quality of attention he was giving her. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked like a man encountering something he had been waiting for. "You were supposed to be in Oslo," Iris said, because she needed to say something, and that was the most neutral thing available, the fact least likely to give anything away. "I was. I came back early." Stellan moved toward her with the unhurried precision she remembered, the kind of movement that suggested he had already processed the situation and made several decisions about how to handle it. "The Oslo meeting concluded faster than projected. I arrived this morning. The briefing materials indicated you wouldn't be on site for the first week of the audit. Briefing materials are projections, not commitments." He stopped at a distance that was professionally appropriate and personally insufficient, close enough that she could see the faint lines the last 2 years had added around his eyes. The particular quality of his stillness that she had once found steadying and now found unsettling. "Hello, Iris." The use of her name did something she refused to allow to show. "Mr. Voss." She kept her voice even. Professional. The voice she used in depositions and boardrooms and anywhere else that required her to be competent rather than human. "I'm here in my capacity as forensic investigator for the FMC. I know, I've read the engagement letter." "Then you understand that my access to your financial records is mandated by regulatory authority and that any obstruction—" "I'm not going to obstruct you." Something moved across his face that she could not immediately categorize. "I'm going to cooperate fully." The receptionist behind the desk had stopped pretending to work. Iris noted this peripherally. "I'd appreciate it if you could direct me to the financial records department and ensure my access credentials are active in your system." "Of course." Stellan nodded to the receptionist, a small, precise gesture that conveyed about 8 things without requiring words, which had always been one of his more unnerving qualities, and then looked back at Iris. "I'll take you up myself." "That's not necessary." "No, but it's courteous." His expression gave nothing away. "Unless you have a specific regulatory objection to being accompanied by the CEO of the company you're auditing in a semi-public elevator." She did not. She very specifically and inconveniently did not. They rode to the 31st floor in the kind of silence that would have been comfortable between strangers, and was deeply uncomfortable between people who had once slept in the same bed for over a year and were now pretending that the space between them was purely professional. "How long has it been?" Stellan asked when they were halfway up. 2 years and 4 months, Iris said, and then immediately wished she had said, "I don't recall," or "sometime," or literally anything that did not demonstrate that she had been counting. The elevator doors opened before he could respond to that. The financial records department occupied most of the 31st floor open plan, with rows of workstations and a glass-walled conference room at the far end that had been prepared for her. She could see the monitor set up through the glass, the stacks of binders, the desk cleared to take her laptop. Someone had known she was coming, even if the CEO had not officially been expected to greet her. A man in his mid-40s appeared from one of the workstations, efficient and cautious in the way people were when they understood that the person approaching had subpoena authority. "Ms. Callahan, I'm Daniel Park, CFO. We spoke by phone last week. Mr. Park." She shook his hand, relieved to have a neutral professional interaction to focus on. "I appreciate the preparation. We want to make this as smooth as possible." His tone was carefully cooperative, the tone of a man who had been briefed by lawyers. He glanced at Stellan with an expression Iris could not quite read. "I wasn't aware you'd be joining us, Stellan." "I won't be staying." Stellan's eyes moved around the room with the systematic attention she remembered cataloging, assessing. "I wanted to ensure Ms. Callahan had everything she needed." "We're fully prepared." "I know." Something in his tone suggested that fully prepared and actually helpful were two things he would be evaluating independently. He looked at Iris again. If you need anything that isn't appearing in the formal record request, you can contact me directly. She should not take him up on this. She knew she should not take him up on this. I'll go through the appropriate channels. Of course. He handed her a card, not a business card, which she already had, but a card with a handwritten number on the back, in case the appropriate channels are less efficient than the situation requires. He left without further ceremony, which was exactly like him. The way he could exit a room as cleanly as he entered it, leaving the air rearranged in ways that took a moment to settle. Iris looked at the card. She looked at Daniel Park, who was watching her with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something he didn't have context for and was deciding whether to ask. She did not give him the opportunity. Let's start with the accounts receivable ledgers for the past 24 months, she said, and put Stellan's card in her jacket pocket rather than her briefcase because she was a forensic accountant and she kept potentially relevant materials accessible not because of anything else. This was what she told herself. The conference room had good light, which she appreciated. Iris had learned long ago that financial fraud hid in the dark, not metaphorically but literally in the poorly lit corners of general ledgers, where auditors were least likely to look carefully in the footnotes that required turning pages rather than scrolling in the line items formatted to blur into the surrounding numbers if you weren't looking specifically for deviation. She was always looking specifically for deviation. The records Daniel Park had provided were thorough. She gave him credit for that. She had arrived at companies where the first 2 days were spent waiting for documents that should have been ready, watching compliance teams scramble to locate files that had somehow become difficult to find. Voss Maritime had clearly prepared. Every account she had requested was documented, organized, indexed, which was itself a data point. Companies that were committing fraud in their financial records did not generally make it this easy to look at their financial records. That could mean several things: that the fraud was hidden deep enough that they were confident surface access wouldn't find it, that there was no fraud, or that someone had prepared these records specifically to withstand this level of scrutiny while something else remained hidden. Iris had been doing this for 9 years. She had learned to hold all three possibilities simultaneously while she worked. The FMC's preliminary brief had flagged 3 areas of concern: anomalies in the accounts receivable timelines, suggesting possible revenue recognition manipulation discrepancies in the cost accounting for 3 specific shipping routes, and a pattern of payments to a subsidiary that had been incorporated 18 months ago and whose business purpose was not clearly documented. She started with the subsidiary, Voss Maritime Holdings, LLC, incorporated in Delaware with a registered agent address and a single listed officer whose name she ran through her background database and found registered to 6 other holding companies spread across 3 states. The payments from Voss Maritime to this subsidiary over the 18 months of its existence totaled $42 million. The payments were regular, precisely timed, categorized as consulting and logistics services. This was the kind of pattern that looked unambiguous until you looked more carefully. She looked more carefully. The payments were all made within 48 hours of a corresponding entry in the accounts receivable ledger. Not as a line item herself, but as an adjustment to an existing line item that had already been closed. A transaction that was nominally complete, being quietly reopened and modified, then closed again, then the consulting payment going out. This was either a very sophisticated revenue manipulation scheme or something else entirely. The structure was almost too clean, too precise, too regular, with exactly the kind of fingerprints she would expect to find if someone wanted the pattern to be discoverable by someone with her skill set. In her experience, fraudsters were usually less helpful than this. She was 3 hours into the subsidiary analysis when her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Theo figured out how to open the refrigerator. He has eaten approximately half a block of cheese and seems very pleased with himself. Should I be worried? Iris set down her pen and looked at the message for a moment longer than it required. He's fine, she typed back. 20 months is when they figure out doors. Put the cheese somewhere he can't reach it. He's very proud of himself. He comes by it honestly. She hesitated, then added, I'll call tonight. After 8, she put the phone down and looked at the subsidiary payment records and thought about what she was going to do about the fact that she was 30 miles from where Stellan Voss was currently working and had in her jacket pocket a card with his direct phone number on it, and that at some point in the next several weeks, possibly sooner, given what she was finding, she was going to have a conversation with him that had nothing to do with accounts payable. She had known this when she took the assignment. She had told herself she could keep the 2 things separate. Professional on one side, personal on the other, a clean line between them that her methodology would enforce even when her discipline failed. She had been building her professional certainty on a set of facts for 2 years. It was time to find out if those facts were as solid as she had believed. The first indication that something was wrong came at 4:47 in the afternoon when she requested the source documentation for the subsidiaries' consulting agreements, and Daniel Park told her carefully that those documents were not in the set that had been prepared. "That seems like an oversight," Iris said. "Our legal team determined that internal contracts not directly related to the flagged transactions were outside the scope of the subpoena." "Your legal team is incorrect. Any documentation related to entities that receive payments from Voss Maritime's operating accounts is within scope." She kept her voice neutral. "I'd like those documents by 9 tomorrow morning." Park's expression went through several adjustments. "I'll need to discuss that with counsel." "Of course. If counsel has questions about the scope of the mandate, they can contact the FMC directly. I have the relevant deputy director's information if that would be helpful." The deputy director in question was Miriam Cross, whose name was on Iris's engagement letter, and who had personally briefed her on the investigation 3 weeks ago. Iris thought about that conversation now with a precision she had not applied to it at the time the specific details Cross had chosen to mention the areas she had emphasized the fact that she had described the suspected fraud in terms that matched the patterns Iris had been hired to look for, almost too precisely as if someone had written the scenario in advance. She filed that thought under further investigation required and began packing up for the day. The lobby was emptier at 5:30, the building's foot traffic beginning to thin as the workday wound down. Iris collected her visitor badge for overnight access from the security desk and was walking toward the exit when she saw Stellan through the glass doors of a conference room on the lobby level, seated across from 2 men she didn't recognize. His posture carrying the specific controlled tension of someone in a meeting that was not going well. She stopped. She was good at not stopping. She made herself do it deliberately. Made herself look because she had spent 2 years making decisions based on partial information, and she was not going to do that again. He was listening to one of the men with the particular stillness that she had learned meant he was angry rather than calm, that the composure was the control rather than the state. His hands were flat on the conference table. His jaw was set at the angle it went to when he was holding something back. The other man was leaning forward, pushing. Stellan's eyes moved to the glass doors. Found her. She should have walked away. She walked away. Outside the harbor was doing what Boston harbors did in October, putting on a performance of light, off water that made the city look like it had opinions about beauty. Iris stood on the sidewalk and thought about the subsidiary payments and the manufactured precision of the fraud pattern and the deputy director who had sent her here and the man she had left 2 years ago who did not look like a man who was guilty of anything except being exactly as difficult to forget as she had feared. She had promised herself she would not come to conclusions before she had the evidence. She had been coming to conclusions before she had the evidence for 2 years. It was time to be better than that. She pulled out her phone and called her sister, even though it was only 6, and she had said 8 because she needed to hear Theo's voice and remind herself why getting this right mattered. "Mama." His voice, when he came on the line, still more breath than consonant, still learning the architecture of language, did something to her chest that no spreadsheet had ever done. "Hi, baby." She walked toward the parking garage. "Did you eat all the cheese?" "Cheese," confirming, not explaining. That was Theo. "Very impressive. Did Aunt Sarah tell you that you're not supposed to open the refrigerator by yourself?" A pause that contained several things, including the beginning of what would probably be an impressive capacity for strategic non-response. "Cheese," he said again, with the satisfaction of someone who has located the most relevant fact. Iris smiled at the harbor, at the fading light, at the evidence she was accumulating that getting this right was worth whatever it was going to cost her. "I'll be home this weekend," she said. "Save some of the cheese for me." She had taken a short-term lease on a furnished apartment in Back Bay, close enough to the Voss Maritime building that she could walk on the days the weather allowed, and far enough from the harbor that she didn't have to think about it every time she looked out the window. The apartment was the kind of space that had been designed for exactly her type of temporary occupancy, efficient, impersonal, furnished with things that matched without personality. She had added exactly 4 items to it since moving in: a photograph of Theo at his first birthday taken in her sister's backyard with cake on his face and an expression of absolute triumph. A mug she had bought at a Philadelphia street market 3 years ago that said nothing but had the right weight in her hands. A paperback of a novel she was probably not going to read. and a framed print of a statistical distribution chart that her graduate school advisor had given her as a joke, and that she had kept because the joke had aged into something that felt like a principle. She was eating takeout at the kitchen table. The subsidiary payment record spread around her in the organized chaos of an investigation in progress when her phone rang. The number was the one from the card. She looked at it for 2 full rings, which was longer than she would have waited for anyone else. She answered, "You looked at the subsidiary records today." It was not a question. "I look at everything," Iris said. "That's what I'm here for." "I know." A pause. She could hear Boston in the background, the particular ambient quality of the harbor at night, which told her he was somewhere near the water. "What did you find?" "I'm not in a position to discuss findings with the subject of an investigation." "Iris." Something in his voice shifted, shedding the professional register with the ease of someone removing a coat. "I know what those records look like. I know because I've been looking at them myself for 6 months. And I know that whoever put them together wanted them to look exactly the way they look to you right now." She was quiet. "I'm not asking you to compromise your investigation. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that what you're looking at is designed to be found." Another pause. "You're the best forensic investigator I've ever encountered. If anyone can see through this structure, it's you." That sounds like something someone would say if they wanted me to look past the obvious. It sounds like the truth. His voice was even careful the way it got when he was being more honest than was comfortable for him. "I know you don't have any particular reason to take my word for anything. I know what you decided about me 2 years ago, but I'm asking you to look at what the evidence actually shows rather than what it appears to show." That's your method, isn't it? Actual evidence over appearance. Iris looked at the payment records, at the pattern she had been building in her head all day, at the shape of a structure that was almost too perfect to be accidental. "I'll look at the consulting agreements," she said, "when I have them." "Park won't give them to you." "He'll give them to me, or I'll subpoena them directly." "The agreements don't exist." His voice was quiet. "That's the point. Someone created the payments and categorized them as consulting services, but there's no corresponding contract because the contracts would have needed to be signed by someone in this company, and no one in this company made that arrangement." "Then who did?" A silence that contained something she could not read over the phone. "I think you already have the beginning of an answer to that," Stellan said. "I think that's why you were assigned to this investigation." She did not ask him what he meant. She was not ready to say out loud what she was beginning to think about Miriam Cross and engagement letters, in the shape of a frame that someone had been building for a long time. "I'll call you when I have more information," she said. "I know you will." Another pause. "How are you, Iris, outside of this?" The question asked in that register made something in her chest go tight, in a way that was not useful. "I'm fine," she said. "Good night, Mr. Voss." She ended the call before he could say anything else. She sat in her impersonal furnished apartment with the payment records arranged around her and the photograph of Theo propped against her water glass, and thought about evidence and certainty and the particular danger of decisions made from incomplete information. She thought about a subsidiary that had received $42 million from a company whose CEO didn't know it existed. She thought about a deputy director who had seemed to know exactly what she would find before she found it. She thought about a man who had looked across a lobby at her like he had been waiting for her to come back and understand something she had gotten wrong. She was a forensic accountant. She believed in proof over assumption, evidence over instinct, the actual number over the rounded figure. For 2 years, she had been living with a rounded figure. It was time to find out what the actual number was. She woke at 2 in the morning with the specific clarity that came to her. Sometimes in the middle of investigations, the way the mind kept working while the body rested and surfaced with connections the daytime hadn't caught. The subsidiary was incorporated 18 months ago. Miriam Cross had been at the FMC for 22 years. The investigation mandate had been issued 8 months ago, a full 2 months before Iris's firm had been engaged. 8 months. 6 months since Stellan had noticed the pattern in his own records. She got up, opened her laptop, and looked at the FMC's public filing database. 22 years of regulatory work, 3 deputy directorships, a career built on shipping enforcement with a particular focus on private maritime companies. Iris pulled up the background records she had run on the investigation principles, the routine research she did before every assignment, names and histories filed away for reference. She had not looked at Cross's record carefully. She had looked at it as confirmation of legitimacy, not as a source of information. She looked at it carefully now. Miriam Cross, born 1972, educated at Georgetown, JD from Virginia, career path through the Maritime Administration before moving to the FMC. Clean record, strong performance evaluations. Family history. Father Gerald Cross, founder of Cross Shipping Lines, a mid-size regional carrier operating out of Portland, Maine. Iris held very still. Cross Shipping Lines. She ran the name through her database. Bankrupt. 2006. Assets acquired through creditor proceedings by a company called Voss Maritime International, then a subsidiary of the Voss family holdings. 2006. Gerald Cross's company had lost a contract dispute in 2005, a shipping route that had been contested between Cross Shipping and Voss Maritime International. The dispute had gone to binding arbitration. Cross had lost. The following year, unable to sustain operations without the revenue from that route, the company had gone under. Miriam Cross had been 24 years old. She had just started at the Maritime Administration. Iris sat with this information for a long time, 20 years. A career built in the industry that had destroyed her family's livelihood. A deputy directorship that gave her the authority to open investigations into private maritime companies. A specific assignment, this investigation structured to produce results that looked like fraud where no fraud existed. This was not the shape of a regulatory investigation. This was the shape of a 20-year revenge project. And Iris had walked into the middle of it because someone had done their research and decided that a forensic accountant with a personal history with the target of the frame would be a useful piece in the mechanism. Either to ensure the investigation produced the desired results, a former intimate might be less likely to question evidence against a man who had hurt her, or as a layer of plausible deniability. An investigator with a personal grievance whose objectivity could be questioned later if necessary. She was either meant to be a weapon or a scapegoat. Possibly both. Iris closed her laptop and looked at the ceiling of her impersonal apartment and thought about what it meant that she had spent 2 years certain about something that the evidence examined carefully and without the distortion of her own fear did not actually support. She thought about Theo, about the choice she had made alone in a hospital in Philadelphia with a name she had chosen herself and a future she had decided she could build without asking anyone's permission. She thought about what Stellan had said on the phone. I know what you decided about me 2 years ago. Not an accusation, a fact stated plainly by a man who had learned to accept the consequences of other people's conclusions about him. She pulled out the card he had given her, looked at the handwritten number. She did not call. It was 2 in the morning, and she had a meeting with the financial records team in 6 hours, and she was going to need to be sharp and controlled, and nothing like the woman who had a 20-month-old son in Philadelphia who had eaten half a block of cheese and had a laugh that sounded like bells, and had his father's eyes in a way that Iris had spent 20 months trying to decide what to do about. She put the card back on the nightstand. In the morning, she told herself she would start making better decisions. It was the most honest thing she had thought in 2 years. She was in the records room by 8:30 an hour before the team arrived, using her overnight access card to sit in the quiet and think with documents in front of her, rather than just in her head. The fluorescent lights came on automatically when she entered, which felt appropriate. The building illuminating her specifically everything else in the early morning dark. She opened the subsidiary files again, and this time she looked not for the pattern of fraud, but for the pattern of construction. Who had built this? When? What materials they had used? The payments from Voss Maritime to the subsidiary were made from an account she had not examined carefully. Yet an operational account listed under a regional division identifier that she had assumed was standard infrastructure. She pulled the account history. 42 payments over 18 months. Each payment authorized with a dual authorization code standard practice for payments above a certain threshold. 2 authorizers required. She ran the authorization codes. One of them appeared in 38 of the 42 transactions. The same individual authorizing nearly every payment. The individual's employee identification number resolved to a name in the HR records she had been given access to as part of the general corporate documentation. Thomas Keene, Senior Director of Treasury Operations. 15 years at Voss Maritime. She pulled Thomas Keene's employment record, his performance evaluations, his benefits enrollment, his compensation history over 15 years, which showed steady increases commensurate with promotion, and then a gap in salary history 8 months ago replaced by a new compensation structure that included a significant bonus payment from a third-party benefits administrator she didn't recognize. She ran the benefits administrator. It was a shell company. Different state than the subsidiary, different registered agent, different officer names that resolved to the same kind of circular holding structure when she followed them back far enough. But the structure, the architecture of the entities, the way the layers had been built and nested was identical to the subsidiary. The same hand had made both. She had enough. Not enough to take to the FMC. Not enough to surface officially without triggering whatever defensive mechanisms Miriam Cross had built into the investigation process. But enough to know exactly what she was looking at, enough to build from, enough to have a conversation with a man she owed a great deal more than a professional phone call. She put the documents in order. She made a list. She thought about what her responsibilities were professionally and legally and personally. And she thought about the ordering of those things and decided that the professional and the legal were in this case pointing in the same direction as the personal, even if the personal was considerably more complicated. At 9 o'clock when Daniel Park arrived and looked at her with the wariness of a man who had spent the night being briefed by lawyers, she asked him to arrange a meeting with the CEO. Park's expression went through several adjustments. "I'll need to check his calendars." "Please do," Iris said. "Tell him it's regarding Thomas Keene." Park went still in a way that told her the name meant something to him. He took out his phone and sent a text message that he did not allow her to see the contents of. His phone buzzed 30 seconds later. "He can see you at 10, Park said. His office, 32nd floor. Iris nodded. She had 50 minutes. She spent them building the kind of organized, methodical, irrefutable case file that she had built for 9 years, the kind that left no room for interpretation or evasion, the kind that was fair to everyone involved, including the people who had been wronged. She thought about Theo eating cheese with the satisfaction of a person who had figured out how the world worked. She thought about what it meant to understand how something worked and to have the courage to say it out loud. At 10 o'clock, she took the elevator to the 32nd floor. She was ready to find out what the actual number was. The 32nd floor was quieter than the floors below. Carpeted in a way that absorbed sound, furnished with the specific restraint of someone who understood that real power didn't need to announce itself. A PA she didn't recognize stood as she stepped off the elevator and showed her to a door at the end of the corridor without being asked. Stellan's office had windows on 2 sides. She had not been in this room before. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. The desk that held exactly 3 items, the bookshelves organized by subject rather than aesthetics, the absence of photographs. That was itself a kind of statement, and the man standing by the east window with his hands in his pockets, who turned when she entered with an expression she could not read and made no attempt to make easier for her. "You found something," he said. "I found several things." She set her folder on the conference table rather than his desk. Neutral ground. "Sit down. This is going to take a while." He sat. She stood. She walked him through it, the subsidiary structure, the authorization codes, Thomas Keene, the benefits administrator, the shell company architecture, the 20-year history of a woman who had built a career specifically to reach this moment of institutional revenge. She walked him through all of it with the precision she brought to every presentation, every deposition, every moment when the facts needed to speak louder than the feelings. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "Keene has been with me for 15 years, Stellan said finally. His voice was even, but she heard what was underneath it. Not surprise, which told her something, but something heavier and more specific. He had access, he had authorization, and someone found what he was willing to do for the right amount of money. Cross approached him. "Almost certainly." She sat down across from him. "The payments to Keene started 8 months ago, which is when the FMC investigation mandate was issued. She needed someone inside to build the paper trail. She had the regulatory machinery. She just needed the internal mechanism." Stellan looked at the folder. "You're going to take this to the FMC. I'm going to take this to the DOJ." She kept her voice level. "The FMC has been compromised. Going through Cross's office would trigger whatever cleanup mechanisms she has in place. The Department of Justice Office of Inspector General handles misconduct investigations for federal regulatory agencies. That's where this goes." A pause. "You've already thought through the entire filing process." "I've been doing this for 9 years. She looked at him. "It's what I do." Something shifted in his expression. Not the composure that held, but something behind it. Something she had been trying not to look at directly since she had walked into his lobby 2 days ago. "You knew?" she said. Not an accusation. A fact she needed confirmed. "When you saw me in the lobby, you knew I was involved in something that had been designed to use me." "I suspected." His voice was careful. I had been tracking the subsidiaries for 6 months. I knew someone inside my company was the mechanism. I had not yet determined who was directing it from outside. When I saw you walk in, when I found out the FMC had assigned you specifically, he stopped. I knew you were either part of it or you'd been placed here because someone had decided you were useful. Useful how? A former intimate of the investigation target. He said it plainly, which she appreciated even as it landed. Either your judgment would be compromised by personal history, making you less likely to question the manufactured evidence, or your involvement could be used afterward to suggest the investigation had been tainted. 2 uses for the same person. Which did you think it was? He looked at her steadily. I thought it was neither. I thought whoever had set this up had made the mistake of assuming that personal history with me would make you less rigorous. They don't know you. Iris looked at the harbor through the east window. I made assumptions 2 years ago, she said, that I should acknowledge. You don't have to. I do. She turned back to him. I heard part of a conversation. I made a decision without asking for clarification. I left without explaining why. A pause. The hardest part, the part she had been building towards since 2 in the morning. And there are consequences of that decision that I should have told you about before now. The quality of his stillness changed. Iris? His name is Theo, she said. He's 20 months old. He has your eyes. She kept her voice steady. She had practiced this, had imagined 100 versions of this conversation, had known it was coming since the moment she had accepted this assignment. I made the decision to raise him alone because I was certain I understood what kind of man you were. I was wrong about that certainty. I'm telling you now because you have a right to know, and because I am not going to make any more decisions about his life without giving you the information you need to be part of it if that's what you want. The silence was the longest she had ever sat in. Stellan stood. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for long enough that she began to build contingencies in her head. What she would say if he was angry, what she would do if he asked her to leave, how she would handle the professional fallout of this conversation happening at all. He turned around. His expression was not what she had expected. It was not anger or hurt or the controlled fury she had seen directed at other people in other circumstances. It looked like a man being handed something he had given up expecting to receive. 20 months, he said quietly. Yes, he's healthy. He's extraordinary. The word came out more honestly than she intended. He's funny and stubborn, and he figured out how to open the refrigerator yesterday and ate a significant quantity of cheese with no apparent regret. Something crossed his face that was briefly and unmistakably a smile. He comes by the stubbornness honestly, she added, which was the same thing she had said to her sister, which told her something about where her mind had already settled on the question of where this came from and what it meant. I want to meet him, Stellan said. Not a demand. A statement of intent measured and clear. I know. We'll arrange that. She stood, picked up the folder. Back to the work. Back to the case file. Back to the ground that was solid enough to stand on while the rest of it found its shape. First, I need to file the DOJ referral. Then we need to discuss Keene and the safest way to handle his removal without tipping cross that the investigation is turned. Then I need to review the authorization logs for every payment over the past 18 months to establish the clean record your company is going to need when this is over. And then, he asked. She looked at him, at the harbor behind him, at the folder in her hands that contained the truth she had been working toward for 9 years, and specifically for 2 days, and in some sense, for 2 years. And then, she said, we have a much longer conversation. His expression settled into something steady and patient that she recognized from a year ago when she had told herself she would have to stop relying on it. I've been waiting 2 years, he said. I can wait a little longer. Good. She walked toward the door. I'll have the DOJ referral drafted by this afternoon. I'll need your legal team to review and co-sign. I'll have Vincent contact you. She stopped. You have a lawyer named Vincent, among others. Why? She shook her head. Some coincidences were just coincidences. Never mind, I'll be in the records room. She left him at the window and the door closed between them with a soft sound that was nothing like a vault, but felt for the first time in a long time, like something opening rather than shutting. The DOJ referral took 4 hours to draft properly. Iris sat in the records room with the door closed and her phone silenced, constructing the document with the same methodical attention she brought to every formal filing, precise language, no speculation, every claim anchored to a specific document reference and a timeline that could be cross-examined without producing a gap. She had filed referrals before had participated in federal investigations at the evidence provision level, but she had never been the originating investigator on something that would require the agency that had hired her to turn its attention back on itself. The FMC investigation that had brought her here would need to be suspended pending the DOJ's review of Cross's conduct. That meant Iris's role as the assigned investigator would end. It also meant that the fraud investigation against Voss Maritime, which was, as far as she could now determine, entirely fabricated, would be superseded by the misconduct investigation against the official who had manufactured it. She wrote the referral to make this sequence inevitable rather than optional. She had learned early in her career that the way you framed initial documentation often determined the trajectory of everything that followed. Bureaucracies followed the path of least procedural resistance. If you built the path correctly at the beginning, you could walk an institution to a conclusion it might otherwise find inconvenient to reach. Stellan's lead counsel was a man named Harmon Park. No relation to the CFO, he had clarified on the phone with the dry specificity of someone who had made this clarification many times, who went through her draft with the attention of someone who had spent his career looking for the sentence that would undo everything. He found 3 places where the language could be tightened and offered 2 suggestions she incorporated without comment because they were correct. He did not ask how she had found the subsidiary structure, or why the assigned investigator had turned the investigation against the assigning official. He was the kind of lawyer who asked exactly the questions he needed answers to and no others. By 4 o'clock, the referral was signed encrypted and filed through the DOJ's secure submission portal. Iris sent a copy to Harmon Park and kept one in her own secure files and felt the particular clarity that came after irrevocable action. Not relief exactly, but the settling of a question that had been held open too long. She was standing at the coffee machine in the corridor when Stellan found her. He did not announce himself. He appeared in her peripheral vision with the quality of presence she had not managed to adequately account for in the mental model she had been maintaining of him during his absence from her life, which was that he had a kind of physical weight that her awareness responded to before she consciously registered him. She had thought that would diminish with time. It had not. Harmon says the referral is clean, he said. It is. He says the framing is sophisticated enough that they won't be able to redirect without leaving tracks. Something in his tone indicated he found this pleasing in a specific way. He's been practicing law for 30 years, and he said it was as well-constructed a document as he's seen. Tell him I said thank you. She poured the coffee. Though I suspect you already knew it was well-constructed, I knew you'd constructed it. The distinction was not small. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him over the rim of the coffee cup. You've followed my career. I've been aware of your work. The careful language of someone who had thought about what he was and wasn't entitled to. You've filed in federal court 4 times in the past 2 years. Each case resulted in conviction. 3 convictions. 1 was dismissed on jurisdiction grounds. The dismissal was a procedural failure unrelated to the quality of your investigation. I know that. She set down the coffee cup. I'm curious about the awareness. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the window rather than her. When you left, I tried to understand why. I looked at what I could find publicly, your professional record, your firm's case history. Not from any expectation that it would change anything. More from the habit of looking at available evidence when I want to understand something. And what did you understand? That you were very good at your work. That you had built a reputation for precision and fairness in circumstances where precision and fairness required significant professional courage. He looked at her. That you had not disappeared into grief or anger, which was what I had been afraid of. The honesty of that last sentence required a moment. I wasn't grieving, she said. No, he agreed. You were building something, which told me that whatever you had decided about me, it hadn't broken you. That was the thing I needed to know. She thought about Theo, about the things she had been building for 20 months, about the fact that she had not in 2 years allowed herself to recognize what the building had been, in part a response to. I should have called, she said. You had reasons not to. I had reasons I thought justified not calling. That's different. She picked up the coffee cup again. I was afraid that if I called to tell you about the pregnancy, you would want to be involved, and being involved would mean having to revisit the reasons I had left, and revisiting them might mean discovering I had been wrong, and discovering I had been wrong would... She stopped. Would have required you to change a decision you had made with very complete certainty, Stellan finished. Not unkindly. I'm good at certainty, Iris said. I'm less good at uncertainty. I know. His voice was quiet. It was one of the things I found most interesting about you. The way you could hold ambiguity in a professional context and then be so absolute about personal things, as if the tolerance for uncertainty was finite and you spent most of it at work. She had never had it described to her that precisely. She found she needed a moment with the accuracy of it. That's fair, she said. I'm not criticizing. I understand it. I operate the same way. He looked at the harbor again, at the October light doing its things with the water. I spend all day making decisions with incomplete information, calculating acceptable risk-building contingency into every outcome. And then I go home and I want the things that are mine to be certain, stable, not subject to revision. Except that people aren't ledgers, Iris said. No? He looked at her. They're not. They stood in the corridor for a moment, the coffee machine humming, the records room visible through the glass, the building carrying on its ordinary business around the extraordinary thing that was happening in this particular square meter of hallway. I want to tell you about Theo, Iris said. Not to explain or justify. Just, I want you to know who he is before you meet him. The change in Stellan's expression was subtle in the way that significant things often were. Not dramatic, not readable as any specific emotion, but a shift in density, like something that had been held in tension releasing by degrees. Tell me, he said. She told him about the pregnancy first. The clinical facts, the timeline, the decision she had made, alone in a city that had felt enormous in the way it does when you are confronting something you didn't plan for. She told him about the hospital, which had been a Tuesday in February. Gray light through the window, and her sister holding her hand, and Theo arriving exactly on his due date, with an air of punctuality she had found even in that state characteristic. She told him about the first months, which had been the hardest and most clarifying period of her life, the way exhaustion recalibrated everything into what mattered and what didn't, the way Theo had reorganized her sense of what she was building toward. She told him the things she had noticed about their son, the way he held opinions from very early, the way he watched everything with the specific focused attention of someone taking inventory, the way he had his father's capacity for stillness and his mother's impatience with unnecessary process. Stellan listened without interrupting, without inserting himself into the narrative, with the quality of attention that had once made her feel specifically seen and that she had subsequently tried to convince herself was a manipulation rather than a characteristic. He likes lists, she said. Or the concept of lists, he lines things up. He'll take the books off the lowest shelf and put them in a row and then look at them as if he's assessing completeness. Alphabetical. No. Something else. I haven't figured out the system. Something crossed Stellan's face. Probably size. I organize by size when I don't know the category yet. Iris looked at him. Largest to smallest, he said. It was a habit from childhood. My grandfather's library was organized by spine height, and I internalized it before I understood there were other options. Theo's rose, always starting with the largest book on the left. She had been trying to decode the pattern for 3 months. He does that, she said quietly. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences, warmer, more tentative, the silence of people standing at the edge of something rather than across it from each other. When can I meet him? Stellan asked. The weekend. I usually go back to Philadelphia on Fridays. She set down the empty cup. If the investigation timeline allows. The investigation timeline will allow. You don't control the investigation timeline. No, he agreed. But I control enough of my own schedule to ensure I'm not needed in Boston on a Friday afternoon. She almost smiled. She stopped herself not because she wanted to, but because she wasn't sure what smiling at him meant, yet what permissions it granted, what it implied about the shape of the thing that was still being determined. One thing at a time, she said. Yes. He stepped back, returning them to the professional register, the calibrated distance. I'll let you finish the day. She watched him go, the same walk she remembered, the unhurried precision, the way he moved through a space like he had already calculated the best route and thought about irrefutable patterns and the evidence she had been ignoring for 2 years, and the particular kind of work that required not precision, but courage. Thomas Keene resigned the following morning, effective immediately on the advice of lawyers who had been presented with the documentation Iris had assembled the previous day. He did not contest the findings. He did not ask for negotiation. This was Stellan told her in a brief call, consistent with what Keene had told him directly in a private conversation the night before, a conversation that had apparently been brief, specific, and had ended with Keene understanding that cooperating with the DOJ investigation was the most strategic option available to him. Iris did not ask what had been said in that conversation. She understood that her professional responsibilities extended to the documented record, and that the spaces between documented events were sometimes where things happened that were better not examined. She was building better habits of discernment about which things to examine and which to accept. The DOJ acknowledged receipt of the referral on the third day. Iris received a call from an OIG investigator named Castellan, thorough and methodical in the way of someone who took institutional corruption personally, who asked her to walk through the documentation and then asked 3 follow-up questions that told her he had understood the entire structure in the first conversation. "The shell company architecture," he said. "You're saying this was built to be found by someone with your specific skill set. I'm saying the structure is precise enough that it reads as intentional display rather than concealment. Someone built this to look like fraud to a forensic accountant without understanding that a forensic accountant would also see the construction marks. The hubris of the technically unsophisticated," Castellano said. "The confidence of someone who spent 20 years building toward a single outcome and stopped checking whether her assumptions still held." A pause. "That's a specific kind of mistake. It's a human kind of mistake," Iris said. "Most of them are." Castellano asked for an in-person meeting the following week. He thanked her for the clarity of the documentation. He did not tell her what would happen to Miriam Cross, which was appropriate because that was not her determination to make. She had provided the evidence. The evidence would do what evidence did. On Friday morning, Iris packed her overnight bag and took the Amtrak back to Philadelphia. She had told Stellan the meeting was arranged for Saturday neutral ground, her sister's house enough space and enough witnesses that the weight of the occasion couldn't collapse entirely inward. She had told her sister, who had processed the information with the efficiency of someone who had been partly expecting it, and had said, "How long has he known, and when?" Iris had said 3 days had produced a silence that contained about 14 things she was thoughtfully choosing not to say. The train passed through Connecticut in autumn, light the trees doing their October performance, and Iris sat with her laptop open but not working, thinking about chains of evidence and what it meant when you trace something back to its origin point. She had left because she had overheard a conversation she had not understood. She had decided not to ask because asking would require confronting her own fear that the man she had been building her life around was not who she needed him to be. She had taken the fear and given it the shape of certainty, which was the oldest trick in the human inventory dressing. What you can't bear to look at in the language of what you've concluded. Theo was sitting in the kitchen when she arrived, engaged in a complex negotiation with his aunt over the distribution of crackers, which he appeared to be winning on points. He looked up when she came through the door with the specific expression she had come to recognize as his version of relief, not dramatic, not demonstrative, just a settling, a registration of something returning to its correct position. "Mama." "Hi, baby." She dropped her bag and picked him up, and he immediately grabbed her braid with one hand and a cracker with the other and informed her at some length about the cracker negotiations and their outcome. Her sister Sarah watched this over her coffee cup with an expression that had several layers. When Theo had been handed back to the crackers and was occupied, Sarah said, "He has his eyes, you know." "I know. You've always known." "Yes?" Sarah set down her cup. "Is it going to be okay?" Iris thought about a man in a Boston office, looking at her like a return of something he had stopped expecting. About the way he had listened to her describe their son with complete focused attention. About 20 months of a child arranging books by spine height with a system she hadn't understood because she had been deliberately not looking for its origin. "I think so," she said. "That's not your usual confidence level." "No?" She looked at her son, who had organized the crackers into a row. "I'm working on having a more accurate confidence level." Sarah considered this. "That might be progress." "I'm told it is." Stellan arrived on Saturday at 11 o'clock. He knocked, which she had not expected. She had half thought he would simply appear in the kitchen the way he appeared in lobbies already present by the time she registered the event. But he knocked and waited, and when she opened the door, he was standing on her sister's front porch in a gray sweater and no tie, which was the most informally she had ever seen him dressed. And he was holding a stuffed rabbit. She looked at the rabbit. "I didn't know what to bring," he said. "My assistant suggested the rabbit." "How old does your assistant think he is?" "Apparently not 20 months. Iris stepped back to let him in. He came through the door and stopped because Theo was standing in the hallway with a book in each hand looking at the new person in his house with the systematic assessment of someone conducting an inventory. The three of them stood in the hallway of a Philadelphia row house on a Saturday morning in October, the light coming through the transom window above the door, and Iris watched her son look at his father for the first time with the particular quality of focused attention that she had not until 3 days ago understood the origin of. Stellan crouched to Theo's level. He did not speak immediately. He waited. Theo looked at the rabbit. "It's for you," Stellan said quietly. "If you want it." Theo set down one of the books. He stepped forward and took the rabbit with both hands. He examined it with the thoroughness of a person conducting due diligence. He looked at Stellan with his gray eyes. Then he walked to the living room, set the rabbit in a specific place in his book arrangement, and returned to look at Stellan again as if to confirm the transaction was complete. Stellan stood slowly. He looked at Iris. She had been telling herself for 20 months that she had made the right decision in raising Theo alone, that she had built everything correctly, that her certainty about who Stellan was had been an adequate foundation for a choice this large. She watched her son lead his father into the living room to show him the book arrangement, and she acknowledged finally and without qualification that she had been wrong about the certainty. She had been right to protect Theo. She had been wrong about what protecting him required. The difference between those two things was the space where the actual work was waiting. She followed them into the living room. She sat on the floor next to her son and the father of her son, and Theo showed them both the system, largest on the left, smallest on the right. The rabbit installed at the end as a new category whose proper placement was still being determined. "He'll need a category," Stellan said, looking at the rabbit. "He'll figure one out," Iris said. "He will." Something in Stellan's voice was careful with weight it was not trying to put down yet. "He seems methodical." "Extremely." She looked at their son, who had picked up the rabbit again and was introducing it to a stuffed bear that had been part of the arrangement for months. "He's been like that since about 4 months. Everything in order, everything assigned." "My grandmother thought I had a disorder," Stellan said. "My grandfather said I had an engineering mind and gave me his library, which is now organized by spine height, largest to smallest." A pause. "I'll bring him to the library sometime. If that's something that would be—" He stopped, calibrating language carefully. "If you'd be comfortable with that." She looked at him, at the careful precision with which he was navigating the space between what he wanted and what he was entitled to, the way he was holding himself to the terms she had set without resentment and without abandoning the goal. He was doing, she thought, exactly what she had asked him to do 2 years ago in ways she had never actually articulated. He was being honest about what he was and patient with the distance and present without demand. She had been so certain he wasn't capable of it. "Yes," she said. "I'd be comfortable with that." Theo looked up from his rabbit negotiations, confirmed both adults were present and accounted for, and returned to the business of integration, satisfactorily, on his terms. She came by it honestly, she thought. Both of them. The afternoon unfolded in the way that charged afternoons sometimes do when no one is willing to acknowledge the charge, with careful conversation and cups of tea that Sarah produced, and then withdrew from giving them space in the way of someone who understood the situation required it. Theo was the organizing principle. This helped. His demands were specific and immediate and required response, which meant that neither Iris nor Stellan had to manage the weight of the unspoken conversation entirely. They could hold it between them and attend to it in fragments in the spaces between this book and Is That a Dog? And the elaborate procedure of getting a 20-month-old to eat lunch. Iris watched Stellan learn Theo. He was methodical about it. This did not surprise her, observing before interacting, noting preferences without testing limits, offering attention without crowding. When Theo wanted to be picked up, he was picked up. When Theo wanted to be set down, he was set down without negotiation or disappointment in either direction. He did not perform enthusiasm or manufacture warmth. He was simply present consistently and without qualification. She had not known how much she had needed to see him be this specifically. "He's not afraid of you," she said while Theo was occupied with lunch, and they were briefly side by side at the kitchen counter. "No." Stellan's voice was quiet. "He seems to be deciding whether I'm relevant. He decides relevance based on whether you're useful to the arrangement." She looked at her son. "The rabbit probably helped. I should send my assistant a thank you. Wait until you see where the rabbit ends up in the taxonomy." He almost smiled. She saw it, the fractional movement at the corner of his mouth that she had learned to read as the full expression, the thing he allowed himself instead of more. She had told herself for 2 years that she had misread it, that the warmth she thought she had seen in it was projection. She had not misread it. The afternoon moved toward evening. Sarah came back and managed the dinner transition with the efficiency of someone who had been handling complicated family situations for decades and could conduct an entire dinner negotiation using nothing but logistics. At 6 o'clock, when Theo's eyes were going heavy and the cracker negotiations had given way to a request to be carried, Stellan stood to leave. He stood in the front hallway where he had arrived that morning, and Iris stood across from him, and the day sat between them with everything it had contained. "Thank you," he said. "For what, specifically?" "For today. For telling me. For—" He stopped finding the word. "For not protecting me from him." She understood what he meant. The instinct to protect Theo from the complicated variables of Stellan's world had never fully separated in her mind from protecting herself from the complicated variables of Stellan himself. She had made one decision to cover both, and the simplicity of that had felt like clarity. It had been avoidance dressed as certainty. "I'm sorry it took this long," she said. "You had reasons." "I had fears." She held the distinction. "I'm getting better at knowing the difference." He looked at her, the particular quality of attention she had tried to file away and failed, and then he did something she had not expected. He reached out and touched her face the way he always had when he wanted to know she was real, a brief, precise contact, the pat of his thumb at her cheekbone. "So am I," he said quietly. He left. She stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed her hand at her cheek. Her son called from the living room. "Something about the rabbit." She went. The second week in Boston was different from the first. The investigation had shifted. The FMC mandate was under review pending the OIG assessment, which meant Iris's formal audit role was suspended, but her access to the records remained, and Castellano had asked her to continue her documentation work informally to support the misconduct case. She was now building the evidentiary file not against Voss Maritime, but against the structure that had been built to destroy it. She found a different kind of work. Less about finding fraud and more about exposing the architecture of a frame, the choices about what to include and what to omit, the timing of the subsidiaries and corporation relative to the investigation, mandate the specific financial pathways that connected Cross to Keene to the shell company network. It was archaeology rather than accounting, excavating a plan layer by layer until the motivation was fully visible. She was good at archaeology. Stellan was in Boston more than he had apparently been in months. His assistant, the rabbit-selecting assistant who Iris was developing a specific appreciation for, had rearranged his Oslo commitments, and he was in the building most days, which meant he was in her peripheral awareness most days, which she was managing with the self-discipline she brought to every professional situation she needed to not let become personal. They had lunch on Tuesday, which was professionally defensible as a working meeting, and was also lunch during which he told her about the legitimate business expansion he had been pursuing for 2 years, technology investment, commercial real estate, a shipping insurance subsidiary that had no connection to the family empire's older infrastructure. He described it with the precision of someone who had thought it through completely and was presenting it to someone whose opinion of the completeness mattered. "You've been building this since before I left," she said. "I started seriously about 6 months before." He turned his coffee cup. "I had been thinking about it for longer, about what the company could be rather than what it had inherited being. Because of Theo, she hadn't known. She was doing the math. Because of you." He said it without drama. "You were the first person I had wanted to build something different for. I had been thinking about what different meant." She sat with this. "And then I left," she said. "And then you left?" "Yes." He looked at the harbor. "I kept building. It seemed like the right thing regardless." "Because it was the right thing." "Yes." He looked at her. "And because I thought eventually you'd come back and see it. I didn't know the mechanism. I didn't expect a federal investigation. But I thought you'd find your way back to checking the evidence." She thought about Miriam Cross at 24, watching her family's company disappear into the Voss family's expanding holdings, about grief that had calcified into a 20-year project, about what it cost to spend that long being certain about what you were owed. "Cross built her entire career around the wrong certainty," Iris said. "Yes. It's a waste." She picked up her coffee. "Not absolution, but a waste." "You're more generous than I am." "I'm more familiar with the error pattern." She set down the cup. "I spent 2 years on one myself." He was quiet for a moment, not performing tact, genuinely considering something. "What made you take the assignment when you realized it was Voss Maritime?" "I told myself I could keep the professional and the personal separate." "And And I think I knew I was coming back to check the evidence, and I told myself a cleaner story. She looked at him. That's the thing about working in evidence. You get better at recognizing when you're rationalizing. Better at recognizing, he said. Not immune. Nobody's immune. You just get faster at catching it. She stood because the lunch was technically a working meeting and she had work to return to. I have Castellano's document request to finish by end of day. Of course. He stood also, which was the kind of automatic courtesy she had missed without admitting she had missed it. Friday. I told Theo about the library. Something in his expression warmed in the way she was learning again to read. What did he say? He said books. She picked up her jacket, with significant emphasis. He has good instincts. He does. She walked toward the exit, then stopped. Stellan. He waited. I want to be careful about the pace of this. Not because I'm uncertain, because I'm trying to do it correctly this time instead of at speed. He nodded once, precise and genuine. That's what I want too. Good. She put on her jacket. Then we understand each other. She went back to the archaeology of someone else's 20-year mistake and thought about the particular patience required to build something on accurate foundations instead of convenient certainty, and found that the patience for once was not difficult to sustain. The evidence was good. The foundation was solid. She had learned to trust that. The library was a Friday afternoon discovery. Stellan's grandfather's collection occupied an entire floor of the Voss family compound in coastal Maine, which Iris had not known existed until Stellan described it during one of the working lunches that had become a structure for the second and third weeks. A Victorian house on a headland north of Portland's salt air and wide windows, and 6 generations of accumulated possessions organized with the specific logic of people who believed that how you arranged your things said something about who you were. She had accepted the invitation to bring Theo there the second weekend, which was faster than she had told herself she was moving. She had then spent 3 days constructing a professional rationale for why this was appropriate pacing and abandoned the project as exactly the kind of rationalization she was trying to stop doing. She wanted to go. Theo would love the library. These were the actual facts. The drive north took 2 hours. Theo slept in his car seat for most of it with the rabbit tucked under one arm, which had been accepted into the taxonomy during the previous weekend's visit and was now categorized apparently under companions placed beside the bear, but slightly elevated. Iris drove and Stellan sat in the passenger seat, navigating from memory, pointing out coastline when it appeared through the trees. You grew up here, she asked. Summers. The rest of the year in the Boston house. A pause. The main house was better. Why? Less observed. He looked at the water visible now in flashes between trees. The Boston house was where my grandfather held court. Maine was where he was just a person. It made a difference. She thought about a child learning to organize by spine height, about the spaces where complicated people were allowed to be simple. Was he good to you? She asked. On balance. A longer pause than the question strictly required. He was consistent, Stellan said, finally, which was more than I had otherwise. He looked at Theo in the rear-view mirror. I'd like Theo to have more than that. He will, Iris said, not as reassurance, as fact. The compound came into view around a curve, a large white house with shutters that had faded to gray, set on the headland with the kind of authority that came from having been there a very long time. The water was everywhere surrounding it on 3 sides, making the house feel like something that had grown from the rocks rather than been built on them. Theo woke as they turned into the drive and looked out the window with the alert assessment of someone arriving at a new inventory situation. Books, Iris told him. A lot of books. He looked at her with his gray eyes confirming he had understood. The library was on the second floor running the length of the south wing. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a rolling ladder on a brass rail, tables and chairs arranged for reading in the specific way that suggested the arrangements had been contested and reconsidered many times over many decades. The books were organized by spine height, largest to smallest, left to right, which Theo noticed immediately. He stood in the doorway looking at it. Then he walked in with the purpose of someone entering familiar territory. Iris watched him go. Stellan stood beside her in the doorway. He recognizes the system. He invented the system. She watched Theo approach the lowest shelf where the books were the smallest and begin examining them with his due diligence expression. He didn't know it came from somewhere. A lot of the things we think we invented came from somewhere, Stellan said. She looked at him. At the house around them, the weight of its history, the library his grandfather had built, and his father had not appreciated, and he had preserved. At the man who had been building toward something different for 2 years, and who had, when she had finally shown up to check the evidence, presented it without performance or demand. She thought about chains of transmission, about things that pass through families like light, through water bending but not breaking, arriving changed but recognizable. "I'd like Theo to know this place," she said, "if that's something we're building toward." "It is." His voice was quiet, certain in the specific way that was not the same as her old certainty, not the certainty of someone who had stopped looking for counter-evidence, but the certainty of someone who had looked at everything available and arrived at a conclusion they were prepared to stand behind. She understood the difference now. She had been practicing understanding it. She walked into the library. Theo looked up from the lowest shelf. He held up a book, small, thin, cloth-bound, in red. He offered it to her with the air of someone sharing a discovery. She took it, a book of navigation charts from 1938. The covers worn the spine intact. "Good find," she told him. He considered this, registered it as confirmation, and returned to the inventory. She sat down on the floor beside him and opened the chart book, the harbor outside the windows doing its afternoon things with the light, and thought about how much of being right consisted of being willing to look again. The OIG investigation moved with the specific efficiency of a federal process that had been given strong evidence and clear direction. Castellano called Iris on a Wednesday morning in November with the tone of someone delivering good news. He was required by professional standards to deliver without enthusiasm. The preliminary findings supported her analysis. The investigation mandate had been formally transferred from the FMC to the OIG's jurisdiction. Miriam Cross had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's completion. "You'll be asked to testify," he said. "I expected that. The FMC will likely want to conduct an independent review of your engagement, whether you were assigned specifically because of your personal history with Voss. That's appropriate." She had thought about this. "My involvement was leveraged by someone who expected my personal history to compromise my judgment. The fact that it didn't compromise my judgment is provable through the record. I documented everything." A pause. "You documented your reasoning process." "I always do. It's good professional practice, and it has the additional benefit of making it very difficult for anyone to later claim I was influenced by factors other than the evidence." She looked at her laptop at the record she had maintained since the first day. "The documentation will support the investigation, not complicate it." Castellano seemed satisfied. They discussed the testimony timeline. She made notes. She ended the call and sat for a moment thinking about the specific satisfaction of a case that resolved correctly, not triumphantly, but correctly, with the evidence doing what evidence was supposed to do. Her phone buzzed with a text from Stellan, Castellano called. "Apparently we're giving him the same answer in the same terms." She smiled at her phone, which was not useful as professional behavior, but which happened. "You also document your reasoning process." "My lawyers do. They have opinions about evidence maintenance that I've found align with yours." She thought about Harmon Park's dry precision. Clearly they do. "When are you in Boston?" "Thursday and Friday." "I was wondering if you had plans for Friday evening." She looked at the question, at the careful openness of it, not an assumption, not a claim, just an inquiry. "I don't," she typed back. "Good," he sent. And nothing else, which was exactly the right amount. The weeks had developed a rhythm that Iris had been watching herself settle into with the deliberate attention she brought to things she wanted to get right. Mondays through Thursdays in Boston, Fridays in Philadelphia or Boston, depending on the week. Saturdays that had begun including Stellan in ways that were building slowly and correctly without the speed that had characterized the first iteration of whatever this was. The speed the first time had been exciting. It had also been, she now understood, partly a way of avoiding the slower work of actually knowing someone. She was doing the slower work now. She was learning the things she had not learned before in the rush of a relationship that had moved fast enough that she had been able to tell herself she knew him while actually knowing only the parts he most easily showed. She was learning that he read for an hour most evenings, that he ran at 6 in the morning, regardless of the weather, that he had opinions about construction materials that became animated in a way his opinions about almost everything else did not. That he disliked being thanked for things he considered baseline obligation, and that he had a specific and apparently irresistible response to Theo's book arrangements, which he studied with the same focused attention as any document he considered worth understanding. She was learning herself in the process, the version of herself that existed in his presence, which was different from her professional self. and different from her alone self, and different even from her mother self in ways she was finding interesting rather than alarming. On a Thursday evening in November, she was at the records room finishing a documentation package for Castellano when Stellan appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had taken a detour. "You're supposed to be in a meeting," she said. "Meeting ended early." He set down one of the cups on the corner of her desk. "What are you working on?" "The payment authorization logs. I'm cross-referencing the original timestamps with the digital metadata to confirm the manipulation sequence." He sat down in the chair across from her and looked at the document she had spread on the table with the attention he brought to things he actually found interesting rather than things he was required to attend to. "The timestamps were modified," she continued, because explaining her reasoning was how she thought, and she had spent years working in rooms where the thinking had to happen in her own head because no one else in the room understood the architecture of financial fraud. Not the original records the copies made for the audit preparation. Someone created a parallel set that matched the originals in everything except a 3-day shift in certain transaction dates. Which is elegant, actually. If you shift the dates slightly, the payment sequence looks like revenue recognition fraud booking income before it's earned without requiring you to change the actual amounts. The money is real. Only the timing appears manipulated. And the timing manipulation looks like fraud to someone who's looking for fraud. To me specifically, I specialize in revenue timing manipulation. Cross's brief to me described exactly this pattern. She wrote the brief to match what I would find. He looked at her. "How did she know what you'd look for?" "I've testified in 3 federal fraud cases. My methodology is in the public record." She set down her pen. "She did her research and still underestimated you. She expected the personal history to be a distortion. It isn't. My relationship with you was separate from my professional function, not compartmentalized, not suppressed, just genuinely distinct. I was able to look at the evidence without it." She picked up the pen again. That apparently wasn't what she predicted. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way that meant he was thinking about something adjacent to what they had been discussing. "She probably predicted what she would have done," he said. Iris looked at him. "Someone with a 20-year personal grievance assigned to investigate the person they believe wronged them," Stellan said. "She probably assumed your judgment would be as compromised as hers." "Probably." Iris looked at the documents. "People use their own decision architecture as a reference point. They assume others are motivated by the same things distorted in the same ways." She paused. "I did that too. I assumed you were capable of the thing I was afraid of because I was afraid of it, not because the evidence supported it. You had partial evidence. I had a half-heard conversation and a lot of fear." She met his eyes. "The fear was louder than the evidence. That's my version of her mistake." He looked at her steadily. "You caught yourself." 2 years later, she turned back to the documents. "I'm working on the timing." He stayed for another hour, reading something on his own laptop while she worked, and the quiet between them was the kind that she had been remembering without acknowledging. She was remembering the comfortable weight of another person's presence, the specific quality of not being alone in the space where she thought. She had missed it for 2 years while she was busy being certain she hadn't missed it. The Friday dinner was at a restaurant Stellan had selected with the specificity of someone who had considered multiple options. Small in the North End, the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone and had arrived at a reliable excellence. She wore a dress she had brought specifically and told herself she had brought because the weather had changed rather than because she was having dinner with Stellan Voss. She was getting better at catching herself. She was not yet done with the rationalizations. He was already there when she arrived, which was something she had not expected. She had been early or thought she had been early. He stood when she came in with the kind of courtesy that was so ingrained it was invisible, the kind that was not performance but habit, and she registered it the way she registered evidence that supported a thesis she was building. "You're earlier than I expected," she said. "I was looking forward to this," he said simply. She sat down across from him and thought, there it is. The thing she had been learning about him that she had not known before, not that he was capable of warmth. She had known that, but that he was capable of saying it plainly when the situation called for it without the framing of irony or the cover of pragmatism. He had learned, or was learning the same thing she was, that what you felt and what you said, it could correspond. They ate dinner with the ease of people who had been practicing being at ease with each other. The conversation moved from Castellano's investigation to the legitimate business expansion to Theo's developing vocabulary, which had recently added the word more with emphatic frequency to the main house, and the question of whether the library had been organized continuously by the same logic for 3 generations, or whether there had been intervals of disorder. My father tried to reorganize it by subject, Stellan said. In 1989, my grandfather undid it in a single afternoon.
How?
He put everything back where it had been. He said subject organization was for libraries that served readers who didn't know what they were looking for. His library was for people who knew what they had. And what if you didn't know what you had? Then you read until you did. He looked at her. He wasn't patient with not knowing. Neither are you. No. He turned his wine glass. I'm working on it. Theo is helping. She looked at him. He sits with things for a long time before he decides what to do with them, Stellan said. The rabbit, the books, whatever he's considering, he doesn't rush to a conclusion. A pause. He seems comfortable with the interval between encounter and categorization. He learned it somewhere, Iris said. Stellan looked at her with the fractional warmth she was learning to read as the full expression. He learned it from you, he said. I'm terrible at tolerating intervals. You're excellent at tolerating them professionally. Personally, He stopped. Go ahead. You make a decision and commit to it completely even when the evidence is insufficient, he said. You're aware of it. You're working on it. But it's still your first instinct to decide to be certain to close the question. She sat with this. Yes, she said. That's accurate. I'm the same way. He set down the glass, which is probably why we suited each other and why we collided so badly when the certainties went opposite directions. 2 people who both need to be right and are both capable of being very specifically wrong. That's an accurate description of a difficult relationship. It's an accurate description of this one. He looked at her. Which is why I'd like to build it differently this time. Slowly enough to catch the places where we're filling in evidence with assumption. That's what I want too. I know. His eyes held hers. You told me at a professional level. I wanted to say it explicitly at a personal one. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. It was a small gesture and a large one simultaneously. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that for a moment, 2 people who had both been very certain about the wrong things and were making a deliberate decision to be slower and more honest this time. Friday is a good start, she said. Yes, he agreed, it is. Miriam Cross was formally charged on a Monday in late November. Iris received the call from Castellano at 8 in the morning, the specific professional tone of someone for whom this was a resolution rather than an event. The charges covered abuse of regulatory authority, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the use of federal investigative processes to advance a personal agenda. She's cooperating, Castellano said. Keene is cooperating. The entire structure is documented well enough that there's no contest. Good. Iris looked out the window at the Boston harbor, which was doing its November thing, gray and cold, and entirely lacking in the performance it had put on in October. What about the Voss Maritime investigation? Formally closed. The OIG's finding will include a statement confirming the investigation was predicated on fabricated evidence. Clean record. A pause. Your role will be acknowledged in the findings which might generate some attention. I can manage attention. I know. He sounded like he meant it. You built a good case, Ms. Callahan. I found the truth, she said. The case built itself. She ended the call and sat for a moment with the quiet that came after irrevocable things. The frame was dismantled. The record was restored. The 20-year project of a woman who had confused grief with justice had finally reached its actual outcome, which was not the destruction of the man she'd blamed, but the exposure of her own design. Iris thought about what it cost to spend 20 years on a certainty that had never been tested against the full evidence. She thought about 2 years on a smaller but structurally similar certainty. About the cost of that measured in Theo's first word, his first steps the morning he had learned to open the refrigerator, all the intervals of a child becoming himself that his father had not been present for. She texted Stellan. It's done. Cross is charged. His reply came in under a minute. I know. Harmon called. A pause. Thank you. She thought about his reluctance to be thanked for things he considered baseline obligation. She thought about what it meant that she was the exception. I found the truth, she sent back. Everything else followed. 3 dots, then, come to Maine this weekend. Both of you. She looked at the message for a moment. Then yes.
Ma.
The drive north on Saturday was different from the first time Theo was awake, for most of it occupied with the rabbit and a set of small cloth books and a complex narration of everything he saw out the window that consisted primarily of variations on tree and water an occasional decisive pointing at things whose categories were apparently still being determined. Stellan drove. Iris sat in the passenger seat and watched the coast appear between the trees and thought about evidence and what it showed when you looked at it without the distortion of what you needed it to mean. What she had was this: a man who had been building something better for 2 years without requiring her to be present to justify the building. A child who had organized the world by his father's system without knowing his father had invented it. A case that had resolved correctly because she had been willing to look at the evidence rather than the story she had already decided on. And herself changed not in the ways she had been afraid of, not diminished or compromised or subsumed into someone else's gravity, but recalibrated. Better at the thing that mattered most in her work and in her life, the willingness to look again when the evidence was incomplete. "He's going to want to reorganize the library," she said. Stellan glanced at the rearview mirror where Theo was conducting an inventory of his cloth books. "I know. You're going to let him, within reason." A pause. "There are some things I have to protect. My grandfather would be very specific about certain shelves. And the rest can be reconsidered." He looked at the road ahead at the coast opening up beyond the tree line. "That's the thing about a library. It's not a fixed document. It should reflect who's using it." She thought about fixed documents and evolving ones, about what it meant to hold something open rather than closed, to treat a conclusion as provisional until the evidence was complete. The house came into view around the curve, white and gray and impermanent looking, in the way of things that have lasted a very long time, and Theo saw it out the window and said something decisive that contained several syllables she couldn't quite parse. "He approves," Stellan said. "He's already planning the reorganization," Iris said. They parked in the drive, and Theo was out of the car seat and heading for the front door with the purposeful energy of someone on a return visit to known territory, which after a single prior visit was itself an interesting data point about his father's geography and the way things could feel like belonging before they were formally designated as belonging. She followed him. Stellan walked beside her, their hands not quite touching until she reached out and he was there, and they walked up to the house together in the November light with Theo already through the door and the rabbit tucked under his arm heading for the library. The weekend unfolded in the space of the house with the ease that Iris had been noticing accumulating over the weeks. Not the ease of things that had always been this way, but the ease of things that had been worked toward the comfortable quality of a situation that had been asked to be careful and had responded. She found the kitchen by memory, which told her she had been paying attention during the first visit, even when she thought she was managing the occasion at arm's length. The coffee maker was European and complicated in a way that suggested it had come with the previous century, and it took her 4 minutes to produce 2 cups, which she brought to the library where Stellan had installed himself in one of the reading chairs and was watching Theo conduct his ongoing assessment of the lowest shelf. "He's going left to right," Stellan said as she set his cup on the side table. "Systematic. He always starts with a survey before he makes any moves. He knows better than to rearrange before he understands the existing logic." He picked up the coffee. "Where did he learn that?" "I have no idea." She sat in the other reading chair and looked at their son, who had pulled a small red book from the lowest shelf and was examining it with the same navigation chart interest he had shown on the first visit. "He comes to conclusions differently than I do." "How so?" "I make a decision and hold it. He holds things open. He had that rabbit sitting in the arrangement for 3 days before he put it in a permanent position." She watched Theo set the book down and pick up another one. "He doesn't close the question until he's certain." Stellan looked at her. Something in his expression was warm and specific. "That's going to be useful to him," he said. "It's going to be extremely irritating to me when he's a teenager," Iris said. "And I say that as someone who has spent the last 2 months learning that it's the right approach." He almost laughed. The fractional version, the thing he allowed himself. She had started cataloging the responses he made that were not yet in the register. He showed most people that were emerging as she accumulated enough data points to recognize the pattern. "How's the testimony preparation going?" he asked. "Finished. Castellano's team has everything. I'll likely testify in January." She turned her coffee cup. "The firm has had some inquiries about the case. Other clients who want to know if I'm available." "Are you?" She looked at him. "I'll be in Boston through the end of this engagement. That's another 3 weeks." A pause. "After that, I haven't decided." He held very still in the way that meant he was paying close attention without directing the outcome. "I have a standing invitation," she said carefully, "to establish the firm's Boston presence. I've declined it twice in the past 2 years because I didn't have a reason to be in Boston specifically. Do you have a reason now? I have several. She looked at Theo, who had accumulated a small pile of cloth-bound books beside him, and was beginning what appeared to be a comparative study. One of them is standing in your library, currently conducting what may be the most thorough shelf audit in this house's history. The other reasons, Stellan said. His voice was quiet and even and not asking her to hurry. I want to build something here, she said, professionally, and I want to stop being certain I've classified something correctly before I've looked at all the evidence. She turned to meet his eyes. I've been collecting evidence on you for 6 weeks. And the evidence is good. She held his gaze. I'd like to keep collecting it. He set down his coffee cup. He stood and crossed to her chair and crouched in front of her, so they were level the way he had done in Philadelphia, on the first visit, bringing himself to the height of someone he was taking seriously. I've been collecting evidence on you since you walked into my lobby and told me you knew exactly how long it had been, he said. The evidence has been good for a long time. She reached out and touched his face. The same gesture he had made in the hallway, the brief, precise contact that asked about reality. Then we're in agreement, she said. We're in agreement. He covered her hand with his, on the current evidence, which remains open to revision. Of course, the fractional warmth fuller than she had seen it, as new evidence becomes available. Theo looked up from his book pile. He assessed the situation with the gray-eyed attention of someone who was not surprised by the data, but was filing it correctly. He held up one of the cloth books. Book, he said, with the tone of a person confirming something that had been in question. Oh? Yes, Iris said, book. He returned to his work. She looked at Stellan, who was looking at their son, and thought about the evidence she had been accumulating on the two of them, on what it meant to come from the same system, to share the same architecture for how you organize the world, and about how much she had missed by being certain too fast. She was done being certain too fast. She was in the business of careful, methodical truth-finding, and the truth here was that she had loved this man through 2 years of deliberate distance, and all she had needed to do was look at the evidence. That night after Theo was asleep in the room that had been prepared for him, a detail that Iris had noted and not commented on the specific advance preparation that said someone had been expecting this visit to include overnights before she had said yes to it. They sat by the fire in the main room and talked until midnight with the ease of people who had been storing things to say. She told him about the year before they had met, about the job that had required her to testify against a man whose lawyers had tried to discredit her, using her working-class background and her gender and every other variable they could locate, and how she had won and how winning had cost her something she hadn't fully understood yet. A kind of innocence about professional fairness, about whether doing the work correctly was sufficient to protect you from the people who wanted you to fail. He told her about his grandfather's death 2 years before they had met, and the 18 months that had followed during which he had been learning what he had actually inherited versus what he had been told he had inherited, and how different those were, and how the process of disentangling them had been the education his grandfather had apparently decided he needed to receive the hard way. They talked about the things that had made them each difficult, and the things that had made them each specifically suited to each other's specific difficulties, and about Theo, who was both of their difficulties, and neither of them who was building a system of his own from materials he had gathered from both sides. At some point around 11, she stopped holding herself back from him. Not dramatically, she had told him she wanted this to be careful and slow, and she meant it. But she stopped holding herself back from sitting closer from the easy contact of two people who had established that they were building something and were allowed to be in the same space without it, meaning more than it meant at any given moment. He held her hand. She leaned against his shoulder. The fire did what fires did. And outside the house, the Maine coast did what coast did in November, and inside the house, their son slept with his rabbit and his books and his complete confidence in the arrangement. I'm staying in Boston, she said at some point when she was half asleep, and her professional, careful architecture was running on minimum. His hand tightened on hers just enough. I know, he said. She had not told him this officially. She had not yet called the firm. He had known anyway from the same evidence she had, and neither of them had rushed the other to the conclusion. The timing, she said, was right, he finished, because you took the time to check. She thought about that. We both did, she said. Yes. He turned his face to her hair. Both of us. Outside the harbor was dark, and the wind was picking up, and neither of them were anywhere else. The Monday after Maine, Iris called her managing partner and accepted the Boston assignment. She expected it to feel like a larger decision than it did. She had been treating it as a large decision for 2 years, the move, the proximity, the implication of presence in a city that had a specific gravity for her. But standing in the Back Bay apartment with her coffee and the harbor visible from the window, it felt less like a pivot and more like a correction. The kind of adjustment you make when you've been running a slightly wrong calculation and you find the error and the revised output is simply more accurate. She had been doing that a lot lately, finding the error, accepting the revised output. Her managing partner was a man named Walsh, who had been practicing since before she was born and who had over 9 years developed a specific appreciation for the quality of her work that he expressed entirely through continued engagement and billable rate increases rather than anything verbal. He said good when she accepted the Boston position, which meant he was pleased and she had made the right call. He asked about the OIG testimony timeline, and she told him, and he said good again, and they ended the call in under 4 minutes, which was the length of their most productive conversations. She called her sister. Sarah's response was longer than 4 minutes and covered several topics, including, but not limited to, Theo's adjustment to the news, anticipated positive. He liked Boston. He liked the car rides. He had a specific attachment to a library he had visited twice. Iris's adjustment to the news observed, she sounded like herself rather than like someone managing a situation, which was the relevant metric, and the logistics of the upcoming move complicated but manageable, and Sarah was happy to help. He's good for you, Sarah said, because Sarah operated on the principle that the thing you were working up to saying was better said directly. He's specific, Iris said, which I think is the same thing. Most good things are. She thought about Theo's careful interval between encounter and categorization, about Stellan's way of building toward a conclusion rather than arriving at it by decision, about the particular quality of being with people who are not afraid of the time it took to get something right. Yes, she said, they usually are. The remaining weeks of the formal engagement passed with the accumulated ease of things that had been decided and were now being implemented. She completed the documentation package for Castellano. She gave a formal statement to the OIG's lead investigator. She participated in a brief consultation with the FMC's independent review board, which was examining how an assignment with a conflict of interest had been made without the conflict being flagged. She answered every question with the same precision she brought to deposition testimony, factual, documented, nothing speculative. She was not angry at the process. The process was correct. The process was what she had spent 9 years trusting. It was the individual who had corrupted the process that warranted attention, not the process itself. She said as much in the consultation, and the review board's chair wrote it down with the specific attention of someone who was going to use it. On a Thursday in her last week in the temporary apartment, she was packing books into a box when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered because unknown numbers were often more interesting than known ones. Ms. Callahan, a woman's voice, controlled and careful in the way of people who had recently had very little control over anything. This is Miriam Cross. Iris set down the book she was holding. I'm aware that any contact with me could be considered improper, Cross continued. My lawyers have told me not to make this call. I'm making it anyway. I'm listening, Iris said. A pause. I want you to know that I didn't anticipate I knew your history with Voss. I knew there was a personal connection. I didn't anticipate that it would make you more rigorous rather than less. Another pause. I assumed you would see what you wanted to see. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand that I didn't choose you as a weapon against him. Cross's voice was careful. I chose you as a weapon against myself. I needed someone who would find the truth eventually, or none of it would mean anything. If I had wanted him simply destroyed, I could have used a less competent investigator. Iris sat with this. That's not a coherent strategy, she said. No, Cross agreed. It isn't. But I've been doing incoherent things in service of coherent grief for 20 years. A long pause. I thought you should know. She ended the call without waiting for a response. Iris looked at the book in her hand. A case study in financial forensics from her graduate coursework, spine intact, marginalia from a decade ago, still readable. She thought about what Cross had said, about the strange logic of a person who had wanted both the destruction and the discovery, who had built a frame and also built into it the mechanism for the frame's unraveling. 20 years of grief looking for a shape that would make it mean something. She put the book in the box. She thought about the things that were worth being certain about and the things that required revision, about the difference between grief that built towards something and grief that built in circles. She picked up her phone and texted Stellan. Cross called. His reply came quickly. I know. My security team flagged the number. She said she expected me to find the truth. Did you believe her? Iris thought about it. Yes. It doesn't change the charges. But I believed her. That's fair of you, he sent back. More fair than she deserves. Maybe she replied, but that's how I do the work. A pause. Then I know. It's one of the things a longer pause than his usual precision suggested. I'll see you Friday. She looked at the incomplete sentence. At the pause where something had been considered and held back for another time. She was getting better at the interval between encounter and conclusion. Friday she sent back. She put the phone down and went back to packing, and outside the November harbor did its gray and different things, and she thought about 20 years of wrong certainty and 2 years of smaller wrong certainty and the specific relief of being done with both. The move happened in stages the way real moves do not. A single clean transition, but a series of overlapping states, 1 foot in Philadelphia and 1 in Boston, and the paperwork always slightly behind the reality. She found an apartment in Cambridge across the river from the financial district with good light and enough rooms and a small garden that would be useful in spring. She had not had a garden before. She had not had the kind of life that included gardens, the kind of rooted expected continuance that made it rational to plant things. She put down the deposit and stood in the empty apartment and thought about what she was planting. Theo made the transition with the equanimity of someone who had been consulted and had found the offer satisfactory. He had visited the apartment twice before the move and had approved it, which Iris knew because on the second visit he had arranged 4 small toys in a row on the kitchen floor and left them there, which she had learned was his method of claiming territory. She had not moved them. They were there when the movers arrived. Stellan's contribution to the move had been characteristically precise and not discussed in advance. When the moving truck arrived at the Cambridge apartment, there were already 2 men there who had apparently been sent to handle the heavy furniture. And when she had expressed an objection, Stellan had said that he had not offered to help, and she had not refused because neither event had occurred. And she had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Next time tell me before you arrange things." And he had said yes with the tone of someone noting a preference for future reference, which was different from agreeing not to do it, and they both understood that. "You're going to keep doing things like this," she said. "Probably." He picked up one end of a bookshelf. "I'm working on asking first." "You're working on asking first more than you used to." "Progress," he said. And she laughed because it was true, and because she could tell the difference between the control that had once felt like a cage and the care that looked similar from the outside and felt entirely different from the inside. She was learning the distinctions. So was he. January brought the testimony. Iris had testified in federal proceedings 4 times before Always as an expert witness providing evidence she had gathered. This was different. She was testifying about the investigation itself, about what she had found and how she had found it, and the specific moment she had understood that the case she had been hired to build was the case she needed to dismantle. The courtroom was in Boston. She sat in the witness chair with the same quality of attention she brought to every high-stakes situation present, precise, nothing extraneous showing. The OIG's counsel was methodical. He walked her through the timeline from her initial assignment brief through the subsidiary analysis, through the authorization code, traced through the referral. She answered every question with the factual precision she had cultivated for 9 years. The language clean, the sequence unambiguous. No room for the record to be read as anything other than what it was. Cross's defense counsel tried, as defense counsels always did, to locate the crack in the procedure. "Ms. Callahan, you had a personal relationship with the CEO of the company you were assigned to investigate. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "A romantic relationship?" "That's correct." "And you didn't disclose this relationship to the Federal Maritime Commission when you accepted the assignment?" "I disclosed it to my managing partner who reviewed the engagement terms and determined that the relationship had ended more than 2 years prior to the assignment and did not constitute a current conflict of interest under the applicable professional standards." "But you were aware of the potential perception issue." "I was aware that the perception could exist. I determined that my professional obligation was to conduct the investigation to the standard my methodology required, regardless of personal history." She looked at the counsel with the steady attention of someone who had been through this before. "The record of my work demonstrates that I did." "You found evidence that ultimately cleared your former partner. I found evidence that the case against Voss Maritime was fabricated. Whether you characterize that as clearing Mr. Voss depends on whether you believe the charges had merit. The evidence establishes they did not. The counsel tried 2 more angles and received 2 more precise responses, and then he sat down. Stellan was in the gallery. She had not looked at him during her testimony, which was procedure, but she looked at him now as she stepped down from the stand. He was at the end of a row in the dark suit, and his expression was doing the thing it did when he was at the point beyond which he had no more calibration to offer. Simply present. Simply there, acknowledging something he could not summarize. She walked out of the courtroom and into the corridor and took 3 careful breaths. He came out 2 minutes later. They stood in the corridor outside courtroom 7 with the institutional hum of a federal building around them. "You were good," he said. "I was accurate," she said. "Good is a different metric." Both. He looked at her with the quality of attention she had stopped trying to deflect. "Are you all right?" She thought about it. Not his performance actually thought about it. "Yes," she said. "It wasn't pleasant, but it was correct. Those are sometimes different things. Often." He put his hand briefly at her back, the kind of contact that was not claim or comfort specifically, but simply the registration of presence. "Lunch?" "Yes," she said. "And then I need to get back. Theo has an appointment at 2. They walked out of the federal building into January in Boston, which made no promises about pleasantness, but was absolutely unambiguous about being real. And Iris thought about the difference between accurate and good, and how the best evidence was usually both. Spring came to Cambridge in the gradual way it comes to New England. Not a decision, but an accumulation. 1 degree warmer, and then another, the garden behind the apartment, suggesting possibility before delivering on it. Theo learned to say garden, and then dirt, and then developed a philosophy about both that involved significant hands-on research. Iris watched her son kneel in the small patch of earth behind the Cambridge apartment and felt the particular quality of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The firm's Boston office opened in February. Small 2 associates and a paralegal with more cases than she had projected in the first month. The city's financial sector had a particular density of the kind of problems she was equipped to solve, and her name had acquired the specific reputation that came from being the investigator who had turned an FMC investigation back on the FMC without breaking her professional standard of evidence. She was not comfortable with the attention. She was competent at managing it. Stellan's legitimate business expansion was going faster than he had projected. The technology investments were performing. The commercial real estate portfolio was generating income that would within 18 months exceed the maritime operations revenue. He described it to her on a Wednesday evening in the Cambridge apartment with the specificity of someone reporting to someone whose opinion he valued rather than someone he was trying to impress. She had noticed the distinction early. She had not said it out loud until now. "You tell me about this as if you want me to check your reasoning," she said. He looked at her. "I do. I'm not an investment analyst. No. But you're the person I trust to tell me when I'm filling in evidence with what I want to find." He turned his coffee cup. "That's more useful than analysis." She sat with this for a moment. "You've been thinking about what I said," she said, "about the rationalization pattern. You described it precisely. It applies to me as much as it applies to you." He met her eyes. "I've spent years building a case for every decision I make. The cases are usually good, but I've learned there's a difference between building a case and finding the truth." "You had a good teacher," she said. "I had a good example," he corrected. "Teacher implies I was being instructed. I was watching someone do the work correctly and learning from the contrast." She looked at him across the Cambridge kitchen table in the apartment with the garden, and the territory marking toys, and the first edition navigation chart book from Maine that Theo had adopted and that now lived on the lowest shelf of the bookcase, organized largest to smallest, and thought about what it meant to be with someone who was paying this quality of attention to who you were rather than who they needed you to be. "I want to say something," she said. He waited. "I was right about some things 2 years ago," she said. "Not the conclusion, but some of the underlying concerns. You make decisions that affect other people without enough consultation. You arrange things in advance without disclosure. You have a tendency toward control that comes from a genuine place and can still be limiting." She looked at him. "I'm not raising this because I want to relitigate the past. I'm raising it because I want us to be honest about the ongoing work." He held very still. "You're right," he said. "I know." She kept her voice even. "I want to hear you say it." A pause. I make unilateral decisions more often than is appropriate. I was better about this with you in the early months, and I have been backsliding as I become more comfortable. He looked at her with the directness she had learned to receive without flinching. I'm not going to stop entirely. Some of it is structural. There are decisions that require speed, and I can't always consult first. But I can be more deliberate about the line between the decisions that are genuinely mine to make and the ones that affect you or Theo. Yes, she said. That's what I want. I'll work on it. I know you will. She reached across the table. And I'll tell you when I see the pattern, instead of building it into a certainty and leaving. His hand covered hers. Deal, he said. It was a small conversation and a large one, simultaneously the kind that doesn't feel like a turning point while it's happening and then reveals itself as one later when you look back and identify the moment when the architecture of something became solid enough to bear weight.
Mom.
On a Friday in March, Theo had his second birthday. The party was in the Cambridge apartment with a guest list Iris had organized, with the same methodology she brought to everything, people who were genuinely important rather than people who should be included for reasons of performance. Sarah came from Philadelphia. Walsh appeared briefly from the firm with a gift he had clearly had his assistant select, but that was well chosen, which told Iris something about his assistant. Harmon Park came with a first edition children's book that he had apparently sourced with specific attention to the spine height organization of the nursery shelf, which told Iris that Stellan had briefed him. Theo moved through his birthday with the systematic pleasure of someone who had decided the occasion was acceptable and was proceeding accordingly. He opened gifts with due diligence. He ate cake with the focused attention of someone for whom the data on cake remained incomplete and required additional research. At some point in the late afternoon, when the guests had thinned and the light was doing the March thing where it came in long and gold through the garden windows, Iris found herself standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the garden, watching Stellan sitting on the low garden wall with Theo in his lap, showing him something in the navigation chart book. She could hear Theo's voice, not the words but the register, the engaged, questioning tone that had been developing over the past months as his vocabulary expanded to meet the volume of things he apparently had to say. And she could hear Stellan's answers, patient, specific, treating the questions as exactly as serious as Theo evidently found them. She stood there for a moment in the doorway. She thought about the evidence she had been collecting since October, about the chain of data points that accumulated into a conclusion she had not been in a hurry to name because naming things too early was her established error pattern, and she was working on it. She was done working on it. She was ready to name it. She walked out into the garden. Theo looked up and offered her the chart book. She took it and sat on the wall beside Stellan, and Theo settled between them, rearranging himself with the efficiency of someone for whom this was the correct spatial arrangement. "What are we looking at?" she asked. "The harbor," Theo said, pointing at a chart page. "The harbor," she confirmed. She looked at the chart. At the Boston Harbor, rendered in 1938 cartography, the same water that was 8 blocks east and that she had been watching since October. "We were looking at where the channels are," Stellan said. He wanted to know why some parts are deeper. "Tidal flow and sediment," Iris said to Theo. "The water moves in patterns, and the patterns shape the bottom." Theo considered this with the gray-eyed attention that she had stopped being surprised by because she had learned to see its origin. "More," he said. "That's the whole principle," she said. "The rest is just detail." He seemed satisfied. He took the chart book back and began examining the page with the focused pleasure of a person who had the information he needed, and was now doing the interesting part. Stellan looked at her. She looked at him. The garden was quiet except for the March light, and her son narrating to himself and the sound of the city doing its Friday afternoon things at a distance. "I love you," she said. Not performing it, not constructing it, just saying what the evidence showed. His expression, the full expression. Not the fraction, the warmth she had been learning to receive without deflecting, opened in the way she had been building toward since October. "I know," he said. "And then I love you." "I know," she said. Theo looked up from the chart book to confirm both adults were present and accounted for. He registered the situation. He returned to the chart. Outside the garden wall, Boston did its spring things. The harbor channels ran deep where the tide had shaped them. Everything in the correct order. The months that followed had the quality of things being built rather than things being managed. A distinction Iris had learned to feel the way she felt the difference between a correct reconciliation and one where the numbers had been made to agree rather than actually agreeing. Her Boston practice grew steadily. She brought on a third associate in April, a young man named Reyes, who had come out of a federal prosecutor's office and who had the instinct for document structure that could not be taught, only recognized and cultivated. She taught him the method, not just how to find the fraud, but how to tell the difference between fraud and the appearance of fraud, between the thing and the frame constructed around the thing. He was a fast learner. She appreciated fast learners who did not mistake speed for comprehension. The cross-examination of her approach that she had feared in the wake of the Cross case, the professional scrutiny of an investigator who had been assigned to investigate her former partner and had found him innocent, did not materialize as a crisis. The OIG's findings had been explicit about the quality of her documentation and the integrity of her process. Two clients who had initially expressed concern called back within a month. Walsh sent her a 2-word email. Well done. For him, this was a significant communication. She was building the kind of professional life she had wanted since graduate school. Not the life of someone who had survived and proved herself, but the life of someone who was doing exactly the work she was suited to at the level it deserved to be done. The satisfaction in this was specific and real, and different from the satisfaction she had built her early career on, which had been partly about proving something and was now simply about the work. She told Stellan about this distinction on a Thursday evening when they were making dinner in the Cambridge kitchen Theo occupied in the garden with a project involving small stones that had been ongoing for several weeks and whose purpose remained elegantly unclear. The proving something phase, Stellan said, when the work is partly about the work and partly about the external validation. She handed him the olive oil. I was in it for longer than I realized. Most people are. He poured without measuring, which she had learned to interpret as a specific kind of competence rather than imprecision. What moved you out of it? She considered this. Theo, partly. When you have someone who is genuinely only interested in what you actually are, rather than what you demonstrate, it recalibrates. She turned the chicken. And this, the past year, the investigation, and everything that followed. She looked at him. Finding out I had been wrong about something I was very certain about, it reoriented the energy, less toward proving, more toward just being accurate. That's what the good work looks like, he said. Yes. She looked at the pan. You're the same, the legitimate expansion. You're not doing it to prove something about the shipping operation. You're doing it because it's the correct direction. It's the correct direction for Theo, he said. It's the correct direction, full stop. She looked at him. Don't undersell the work by making it only about him. He looked at her with the expression that was still her favorite thing to catch the full warmth, the unguarded moment that she had spent 2 years deciding was projection, and that she had now spent 8 months learning was simply him. You're right, he said. I know. She handed him the wooden spoon. Stir. He stirred. Outside in the garden, Theo made a sound of satisfaction, which meant the stone project had reached a conclusion he approved of. She did not go to check. She had learned that his conclusions were sound, and that inspecting them prematurely was more for her benefit than his. The main house, Stellan said. I want to ask you something. She looked at him. I'm considering having some work done. The south wing. It needs structural repair, and I've been putting it off because I don't use those rooms. He kept his eyes on the pan. I'm thinking about not putting it off anymore, about making those rooms usable. She understood what he was not quite saying, which was that the south wing of a house on the Maine coast would make a very fine space for a family to stay in, and that making it usable was a statement about what kind of family was expected to be staying there, and for how long, and with what degree of permanence. What are the structural issues? She asked. Foundation on the seaward side. The previous repairs were done in the 70s, and they're due for replacement. He looked at her then. I thought you might want to see the plans before I approve the contractor. You're asking me to review the plans. I'm asking if you want to. She thought about what he was actually asking, not about the structural repairs, about the south wing, about Maine and permanence, and the difference between being someone who visited a house and someone who was part of what the house was. Yes, she said. I want to. He nodded once, the precise confirmation of someone whose offer has been met. Good, he said. And then with the fractional warmth at the corner of his mouth, that she had cataloged and could now read without any ambiguity at all, I'll have the architect send them over. She turned back to the chicken and thought about the foundation of things, how much invisible work went into what held, how the repairs done badly decades ago eventually required honest attention, How the best structures were not the ones that had never needed work, but the ones that had been worked on honestly when the work was due. In April, Thomas Keene's cooperation agreement was finalized, and he testified against the shell company network that had provided the infrastructure for Cross's frame. The network turned out to be more extensive than even Iris had mapped 3 additional entities, 2 additional human participants, and a paper trail that led to a law firm that had been providing the corporate structures as a revenue stream without apparently knowing the specific use to which they were being put. Castellano called her with the update as he had taken to doing when significant developments occurred, which she had noted and appreciated. The law firm is cooperating, he said. They're separating themselves from the specific participants as fast as they can manage. Of course they are. She was at her desk, the harbor visible from the office window. How much of this traces back to the original cross-shipping bankruptcy? Directly, Keene was recruited 12 months ago, but Cross has been building the infrastructure for 4 years. A pause. She was very patient. She was certain, Iris said. Patience and certainty are different things. Patience requires tolerating uncertainty. She didn't have to tolerate it because she had decided on the outcome. Castellano was quiet for a moment. That's a useful distinction. It's an important one in fraud investigation. People who are patient in the genuine sense are usually harder to catch. People who have merely decided on an outcome and are executing methodically, they build in the same assumptions that made them certain. Those assumptions are where the mistakes are. Cross assumed you'd be distracted by the personal history. Yes, because she assumed personal history distorts judgment. For her, it did. She had no framework for someone who could hold the personal and the professional as genuinely separate domains. A pause. Can everyone do that? She thought about it honestly. No, most people can't. I've spent 9 years developing the capacity, and I'm still not reliable at it under all conditions. She looked at the harbor. But I'm better than I was. Better than you were is how the work gets done, Castellano said. Yes, she said. It usually is. After the call, she sat for a while with the specific quiet that came after resolution. Not triumphant, not celebratory. Just the settling that followed the completion of a long-running calculation. The Cross case had begun for Iris in October when she had walked into a lobby and found something she hadn't expected. It had resolved through the winter into the spring morning with the harbor visible, and the question of Miriam Cross and her 20-year certainty finally reaching its actual conclusion. She thought about what it cost to be certain about the wrong thing for 20 years, about the shape of a life organized around a conclusion that had never been tested against the full evidence. She thought about 2 years, smaller, but the same structure. Then she thought about where she was now, in an office with a garden she was learning to tend with a son who organized the world by his grandfather's system, with a man who was sending her the structural repair plans for a main house, because he had decided to ask before arranging. She was done with the accounting of loss. She had better evidence to work from. She picked up the next file on her desk and went back to work. The South Wing plans arrived on a Tuesday. They were thorough, the kind of architectural documentation that reflected someone who had grown up in a house where things were done correctly or not done, and Iris spread them on her desk after the last client call of the day and went through them with the same attention she brought to financial documents. She found 2 things she wanted to ask about: a load-bearing modification on the seaward wall that she thought might be underpowered given the coastal exposure, and a room allocation in the upper floor that seemed to leave certain adjacencies unresolved. She marked both. She emailed the architect with her questions, copying Stellan. His reply came in 40 minutes. She says the seaward modification is specified for the 100-year wind load standard for coastal Maine. You're right to ask. I'd ask the same thing. And then on the room allocation. I left it open on purpose. Some things should be decided by whoever is going to use the space. She looked at that for a while. Then she wrote back. The room on the Upper East is the one with the harbor view on 3 sides. His reply, yes. She sat with this for a moment, with the careful honesty she had been cultivating, with the evidence she had been accumulating, with the question that had not yet been asked in the explicit terms that she believed it eventually needed to be. That room would make a very good office, she wrote back. A longer pause this time. I had hoped you'd think so, he replied. Would you be willing to discuss the allocation in person? I'll be in Cambridge Thursday. She looked at the plans, at the room, at the harbor visible through 3 windows in an architect's rendering of a house on the Maine coast that was being rebuilt for whoever was going to use it. Thursday, she confirmed. She put the plans in her briefcase and turned off the office light. and thought about what it meant to say yes to a room in someone's house, which was different from saying yes to a dinner or a weekend visit or any of the incremental steps she had been taking. A room was a claim. A room was something permanent in the plan. She thought about all the evidence she had been collecting since October. She thought about the navigation chart book on the lowest shelf of the bookcase at home, organized largest to smallest exactly right. She thought about a garden she was learning to tend, about a son who had decided that the Cambridge apartment and the main house and the Voss Maritime building were all in the correct taxonomy, connected by the same organizing principle. She thought about a man who was asking before arranging now, who had sent her the plans before approving the contractor who had left a room open on purpose and called it whoever is going to use the space. She had been building toward a conclusion for 8 months. She was done with the interval. She was ready to close the question. He came on Thursday with the architect's revised plans and a bottle of wine and the specific quality of attention of someone who understood that a conversation was being approached and was prepared to have it honestly. Theo was at Sarah's for the week, a standing arrangement now, one Thursday night per month, which gave Iris working hours that ran later and gave Sarah what she called grandmother practice, with the confidence of someone who had been practicing since birth. The Cambridge apartment was quiet in the specific way it was when Theo wasn't in it, which Iris had learned to experience not as absence but as a different kind of presence. The impression of him in the arranged books, the stones on the garden wall, the small territories he maintained with the consistency of someone who understood that the world required regular tending. They ate dinner at the kitchen table with the plans spread at one end, and she told him what she had marked, and he told her what the architect had already corrected and what remained open, and the conversation moved between the practical and the adjacent to practical in the way their conversations did when something was being approached at the correct speed. After dinner, they took the wine to the garden, which was doing its April things, now the light lasting longer, the small plants she had put in March showing the first signs of intent. "The room," she said. "Yes." He looked in the garden. Not at her, which was the specific honesty of someone who was letting the other person set the pace. "I want to ask you something, formally." "Ask." He turned to look at her. In the April light with the last of the evening in it, he looked like the evidence she had been accumulating presented all at once the careful attention, the contained warmth. The man who had been building something different for 2 years before he knew she was coming back to see it. "I want to ask you to make the south wing yours," he said. "Not the room, the wing, the house." He paused. "I want to ask you and Theo to make the main house part of what you live in rather than where you visit. I want—" He stopped. The precision he usually brought to language seemed to be encountering something it hadn't fully prepared for. She waited. "I want us to be a family in the way that has an address," he said. "Not all in the same place immediately. I understand the pace we've been keeping, but I want you to know that the direction I'm building in is toward shared ground, toward permanence. And I want to know if that's what you're building toward too." She looked at him for a long moment. The garden was quiet. The April light was going. "Yes," she said. "That's what I'm building toward." Something in his expression settled the specific settling of someone who has held a question carefully for a long time and has now received the answer that the evidence had been pointing toward, and that still required the actual words to become real. He reached for her hand. She gave it. They sat in the garden with the April light and the wine, and the question answered, and the plans still spread on the kitchen table, and Iris thought about all the evidence she had gathered, all the things she had gotten wrong, and then write all the careful interval between encounter and conclusion that had brought her to this specific garden on this specific evening. She thought about chains of custody, the legal term for documenting that evidence has passed from hand to hand without being altered, the thing that made evidence admissible, the proof that what you had was what it had always been. She had handed her heart to this man once before without proper documentation. She had panicked when the provenance seemed uncertain. She had spent 2 years in a chain of custody dispute with herself. Now she had the documentation. The record was intact. The evidence was admissible. She was prepared to rest her case. The summer renovation brought the main house to life in ways that Iris had not anticipated, and Stellan apparently had. She arrived the first weekend in June with Theo and 3 boxes of books, and found the south wing open. The old plaster replaced the foundation. Rebuilt the windows clean to a transparency the house had probably not had since it was built. The seaward wall stood solid against the June light, correctly specified for the 100-year load, and the room on the Upper East with the harbor view on 3 sides was empty and waiting. Theo walked in ahead of her as he always did, conducting his territory assessment. He went through the south wing systematically room by room, looking at corners and windows and the way the light moved. At the end, he stood in the doorway of the Upper East room, looking at the harbor. "Good," he said. This was his highest designation. He reserved it for things that required no further qualification. "Yes," Iris agreed. She put her hand on the doorframe. She looked at the harbor through 3 windows, the June water bright and direct and entirely different from the November gray she had first watched from Stellan's office. Different season, different light, same water. The channels running where they always ran. She had not moved in yet. They had talked about the pace Stellan, without pressure Iris, with the deliberate self-awareness she was still developing about when caution was wisdom and when it was avoidance. They had agreed on the summer extended stays increasing time, letting the house become familiar rather than arriving at it fully decided. She had kept the Cambridge apartment through December. She was beginning to understand that December was a formality. Stellan proposed on a Saturday morning in July. Not with ceremony, not with performance. He came into the kitchen where she was attempting the European coffee maker. She had mostly mastered it over the summer, but it still required patience she did not always have before the first cup. And he stood in the kitchen doorway with the morning light coming through the seaward windows. And he said, "I want to marry you. I want to ask you properly with whatever occasion or presentation you need. But I wanted to say the actual question first before the occasion so you know what the occasion is about." She looked at him over the coffee maker. He looked back at her with the steady gray eyes and the fractional warmth that she had cataloged into full legibility over 10 months, and that she could now read with the precision she brought to everything she chose to understand. "Yes," she said. "I haven't asked yet." "You asked," she said. That was asking. The occasion can come later. He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of her and took her face in both hands with the careful precision he brought to things he wanted to be exact about. "Iris Callahan," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said again. Still not a performance, still just the word the evidence required. He kissed her, and the coffee maker finished its process, and from upstairs came the sound of Theo waking up and beginning the narration of his morning that had become the daily evidence of everything she had built. They told Theo at lunch. He was at the stage of language where he understood more than he could say, which Iris had found was also a useful description of most adults she knew. "Stellan and I are going to get married," she said. "That means we're going to be a family with the same house and the same name if you want that." Theo looked at Stellan, then at her, then at the lunch on the table which was requiring attention. "Name," he said. "Your name can stay Callahan, or it can be Voss, or it can be both," Iris said. "We'll figure that out together." He considered this with the gray-eyed patience that no longer surprised her at all. "Books," he said. This was not a non sequitur. He pointed at the doorway that led to the library. "Yes," Stellan said. "All the books are yours." This satisfied him. He returned to lunch with the air of someone who had received the key information and would now let the process proceed at its natural pace. Sarah cried when Iris called her, which was unexpected from Sarah, and then laughed at herself for crying, which was entirely expected. "I knew in October," Sarah said, "when you called from Boston and you sounded like you were managing a situation." "I was managing a situation." "You sounded like you were managing it on purpose, so you wouldn't have to admit what was actually happening." Sarah's voice was warm and direct. "You've been in love with him for 3 years, and you spent 2 of them on a technicality." "It wasn't a technicality." "It was a technicality," Sarah said, with the confidence of someone who had watched from outside the situation and had no investment in the self-justification. "You were afraid and you found a reason. That's a technicality." Iris thought about this. "That's probably accurate," she said. "I'm always accurate about you," Sarah said. "You're my easiest read. Don't tell anyone." The wedding was in September at the main house. Not a large occasion. Iris had known from the beginning that it would be small, not because she wanted to diminish it, but because she understood that the significant things in her life were almost always small by external standards and large by actual ones. The guest list was 23 people, which included Walsh, who came in a good suit and shook Stellan's hand with the assessment of someone doing a final due diligence. Harmon Park, who brought a gift that was a first edition of a legal history text and which she found perfect. Castellano, whose presence was unexpected and whose brief congratulations were entirely sincere, and Sarah with Theo, who had been given the role of carrying a small basket of stones he had collected from the garden, and who performed this function with the gravity it apparently warranted. The ceremony was at the headland looking at the harbor. She wore something simple in the color of the September water, and she walked to the headland through the grass with Stellan beside her. They had decided there was no tradition they were trying to satisfy that required them to process separately, and Theo walked between them carrying his stones. They said what they had written themselves, which had been a more difficult process than either of them had expected, and which had resulted after several drafts in language that was honest rather than ornamental. She said, "I know the exact moment I started collecting evidence on you. I know what the evidence showed over time. I know that I read some of it wrong and had to go back and read it again correctly. I'm making this commitment with the full record in front of me, and the record is good." He said, I have been building toward this for longer than I knew. I want to continue building with you rather than for you. I want to be worth the standard of evidence you apply to everything. I want to earn it specifically and continuously because that is what it deserves. The September Light did what September Light does on the Maine coast, clear and specific and without any romance except the real kind, the kind that is made of actual things rather than manufactured atmosphere. Theo deposited his stones at their feet, looked up to confirm the occasion was proceeding correctly, and then sat down in the grass to sort them by size. The celebrant declared them married. Around them, 23 people who were genuinely happy bore witness. Below the headland, the harbor moved in its channels deep, where the tide had shaped it consistent and indifferent to occasion in the way that made it reliable. The Cambridge apartment came off the lease in December. She had been right that December would be a formality. The transition from primarily Cambridge to primarily Maine with Boston for the week had happened by degrees through the fall, the same gradual accumulation as the spring had been 1 degree warmer, and then another, until the apartment was more storage than home, and the drive north on Fridays was the return rather than the departure. She kept the Boston office. She would always keep the Boston office. The harbor was 8 blocks east, and she had learned over the past year that she did her best thinking with water visible, which was either something she had always known or something she had learned in proximity to a man who had grown up understanding that the channels run deep, where they've been shaped by consistent motion. Her practice was by December exactly what she had wanted it to be, the kind of work that required her best capacity and left room for the rest of her life. She had the 3 associates and a growing reputation for the specific kind of case that other investigators found complicated because they could not hold the technical and the human simultaneously. She did not find it complicated. She had learned that the two were always the same thing, that every fraud was finally a human decision, and every human decision left evidence, and that the work of her life was understanding how the evidence connected to the truth, rather than how it could be made to point somewhere more convenient. She had stopped being convenient. The Cross sentencing was in November. Miriam Cross received 3 years with eligibility for reduced term on the basis of full cooperation. The sentence was lighter than Castellano had anticipated and heavier than Cross had apparently expected. She was 62 years old. Iris read the sentencing report and thought about 20 years spent building toward a conclusion that had been wrong from the beginning. About the specific cost of certainty in the absence of full evidence. She thought about what Cross had said on the phone in December. I needed someone who would find the truth eventually, or none of it would mean anything. She had thought about this many times since, about the strange architecture of a person who wanted both destruction and discovery, who had built in her own undoing because the plan without it felt hollow. She thought it was grief, ultimately grief that had organized itself into a plan, because grief without a plan was just grief, and Miriam Cross had not been able to tolerate just grief. She understood this. She had spent 2 years making her own grief into a certainty because certainty was more manageable. She did not feel generous toward Cross, but she understood her, which was different and in its own way more significant. She filed the sentencing report in the case archive and closed the folder. Done. In January, Theo's 3rd year, deep winter on the Maine coast, the harbor doing its January things that were nothing like any other month's things, gray and white and absolute. She was working in the Upper East room when she heard the front door open and Stellan's voice and Theo's response from the library, where he had been conducting an ongoing project involving the reclassification of certain shelves. She heard them move through the house. She heard Stellan ask about the project. She heard Theo explain it with the expanding vocabulary of a 3-year-old who had decided that language was a tool of significant interest and was using it accordingly. She did not go down immediately. She sat in the Upper East room with the harbor view on 3 sides, and listened to them for a moment, her husband and her son in the library below, conducting the ordinary business of an ordinary evening in a house that had been rebuilt from its foundation, because some things, when the old repairs fail, require honest attention rather than management. She thought about what she had built, about the method that had brought her here, the patience of the interval, the discipline of looking at the full evidence, the willingness to revise when the record required revision. She thought about the case she had closed and the one she was still in the middle of, the ongoing work of a life that was not a solved problem, but a practice. She thought about what she would tell Theo someday when he was old enough to ask about the work she did. She would tell him, "You follow the evidence, not where you want it to go, not where it's easier for it to go, but where it actually leads." Sometimes that's inconvenient. Sometimes it means changing your mind about something you were very certain about. The certainty is not the goal. The truth is the goal. And the truth is usually more interesting than whatever you were certain about. She would tell him that his father had been patient, and that his mother had been slow to look at the full record, and that the combination of those two things had produced him and this house and this library and the system of organization they shared without having discussed it. The one that had passed through a grandfather who believed that a man who runs an empire should understand the architecture of complex structures through a daughter who believed that the evidence always tells you more than you think, if you're willing to look at it without fear. She would tell him all of this. But not yet. He was 3. He was reorganizing the library. She saved her work and closed the laptop. She went downstairs. The library was warm, and the January light through the south windows was doing the specific thing it does in Maine, in winter, low and clear and without ambiguity, showing everything exactly as it was. Theo was on the floor with 3 stacks of books around him, working through a reclassification project that appeared to involve size, color, and a third criterion she had not yet decoded. Stellan was in the reading chair with a cup of coffee and the architect's plans for the East Garden, which was the spring project. He looked up when she came in. She sat down on the floor next to Theo, who handed her a book to hold without looking up, which meant she was needed in an auxiliary capacity. "What's the third system?" she asked, looking at the stacks. Theo considered her question with the gray eyes. "Heavy," he said. She looked at the stacks, left to right, large, medium, small. Within each size arranged by weight, she confirmed by checking. "He decided color was insufficient," Stellan said. "Color is insufficient," Theo confirmed. Iris looked at the stacks, at her son's entirely sensible multivariable classification system, at her husband watching them over his coffee with the warm precision she had learned to receive completely. "Fair enough," she said. She held the book she had been given and helped with the inventory and thought about the weight of things, the actual measurable physical weight of objects, which was real and specific and had been the correct third variable all along. She thought about evidence and proof and the things you learned when you were willing to look at the full record. She thought about the weight of what she had. She thought about how it was exactly right. Outside, the Maine winter was doing its absolute things. In the library, the work of organization continued with the patience of people who understood that getting the system right was worth the time it took. They sat together in the January light, all 3 of them building the arrangement. 6 months later, spring returned to the Maine coast with the same accumulative quality it always had, not arriving, but becoming 1 degree at a time, until the garden behind the house was full of things Iris had planted in March, and Theo had relocated according to a system she was still decoding. The East Garden project was finished by May. The architect had been excellent. The bones of the space, the stone walls, the headland view. The path down to the water that Theo had discovered in winter and claimed as a regular route remained exactly what they had been. The new elements were structural, proper drainage, raised beds, a stone bench at the headland that caught the morning light in a way that made it the best place in the world to drink coffee and think. She sat on the bench on a Tuesday morning in May, before the office opened, and before Theo woke, and before the day became what it would become, and did nothing in particular except exist in the specific quality of the morning. This was new. She had not been good at doing nothing in particular. She had been good at productivity, at the disciplined use of time, at converting available minutes into progress toward measurable goals. The capacity to simply sit and receive a morning without converting it into anything had taken months to develop and was still not entirely reliable. She was working on it. The cross case had closed its final appeal in April. The sentence stood: The FMC had completed its internal review and implemented new protocols for conflict of interest disclosure and investigator assignments, which Iris had been consulted on and which were, she thought, good. Not perfect. Nothing procedural was ever perfect, but honest, which was the thing that mattered. She had written a brief analysis of the case for a forensic accounting journal, sanitized for confidentiality, focusing on the structure of the manufactured fraud and what it revealed about the assumptions people made when they built financial deceptions. It had been cited 17 times in the 4 months since publication, which Walsh had mentioned in a quarterly review email as an example of firm visibility. She had not told him she had written it specifically as a record, the kind of documentation you create so that the evidence of what happened exists in a form that can be reviewed later. Old habits. Reyes had become excellent in the way she had hoped, not in her image, but in his own method, which was more intuitive than hers, and caught things she sometimes missed because she was looking for the pattern rather than the anomaly. She had promoted him in March. He had responded by taking on 3 cases she had planned to handle herself and solving 2 of them faster than she would have. She found this satisfying in the specific way that watching someone be exactly what they are is satisfying. She was building something that could exist without her being the only competent person in it. This too was new. On a Saturday in June. 1 year after the first summer renovation, Stellan came up to the Upper East room while she was working and stood in the doorway in the way he had learned to stand when he had something to say that he was deciding how to say. She had learned to wait. She was much better at waiting than she had been. "I want to talk about something," he said. "All right." He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her desk, which he had positioned there in the fall, and looked at her with the full gray attention. "Theo has been asking about siblings," he said. She looked at him. "He hasn't asked me directly," she said. "He's been asking the library." "Yes, he's been asking the library and the stones and the bench at the headland." Stellan's expression was doing the warm, specific thing. He has distributed the inquiry broadly. He's thorough. He is. He held her gaze. "I want to know if it's something you're also considering, not as a pressure or a timeline, as a question." She had been considering it. She had been considering it since March, in the way she considered things that she was not ready to say out loud, holding it open, letting it develop its own evidence, waiting until the conclusion was the one that came from the full record rather than the one she had talked herself into. "Yes," she said, "I'm considering it." The warmth in his expression deepened. "Good. It's not a certainty yet." "I know." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking for certainty. I'm asking if the interval is open." She thought about Theo organizing the library by size and weight, and the third variable that was still being determined, about the navigation chart book on the lowest shelf, about the bench at the headland catching morning light, about the evidence she had, which was the best kind, abundant, varied, gathered over time, reviewed without distortion. "The interval is open," she said. He stood. He crossed to her desk and leaned down and kissed her with the unhurried precision she had learned to meet without the deflection that had once been her first response to being fully attended to. "Good," he said again against her mouth. "You keep saying that. It keeps being accurate." She laughed. Not the managed version, the actual one, the one that came from something being genuinely funny rather than from social function. He had been generating this response with increasing frequency, and she had noted it as one of the best data points in the entire evidentiary record. He went back downstairs. She went back to the work on her desk. In the library below, she could hear Theo's morning narration starting the slow inventory of a day, beginning the systems being checked and found intact. She thought about evidence and certainty, and the crucial difference between them, which was that certainty was a decision and evidence was a foundation, and that what you built on a foundation could be revised and improved as the foundation held, while what you built on a decision was only as good as the moment you made it. She was building on foundation now. The harbor was visible from 3 windows. The light was excellent. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. End ST 56. The weight of proof. The summer passed the way good things do not, in spite of being ordinary, but because of it. Theo turned 3 in March, and 4 by the following winter, and every month added something to him that Iris cataloged with the specific attention she brought to things she wanted to remember accurately. The vocabulary expanded steadily, always running a few months ahead of what books predicted, always circling back to the subjects that interested him. Organization, water. The classification of physical objects and acquiring new subjects with the systematic enthusiasm of someone who had decided the world was an inventory of infinite interest. He started at a small school in the fall half-days in the town, 6 miles from the house. The teacher called Iris after the first week to tell her that Theo had reorganized the book corner by spine height and that the other children had, after initial resistance, adopted the system and found it faster. The teacher's tone suggested she was not entirely sure whether to report this as a success or a concern. "It's a success," Iris told her. "He'll offer to help with anything that he thinks could be organized better. You can redirect him or you can let him. Either works." "He's very certain about the method," the teacher said. "He is." Iris thought about this. "He's also very willing to revise when someone shows him a better system. He doesn't confuse confidence with certainty." A pause. "That's an unusual quality in a 4-year-old. He comes by it through practice," Iris said. "We work on it at home." The firm's Boston office occupied new space by October, larger, proper conference rooms, a dedicated records room with the kind of security specification Iris had wanted from the beginning. She had 3 associates and a research analyst, and more work than she could comfortably manage, which was the correct problem to have. She was known by the end of that year as the investigator who had dismantled the crossframe, though the case was only referred to obliquely in professional circles, the way significant things that have been fully resolved are sometimes referred to as a demonstration of method rather than a recounting of events. She was known for a particular kind of case, the kind where the evidence was designed to mislead, where someone had built a structure intended to look like one thing, and she would find what it actually was. She had a reputation for asking the question, who benefits from this evidence being found, before she accepted that the evidence meant what it appeared to mean. She had developed this approach through personal experience. She was not modest about the development. On the last day of the year, they stood at the headland in the specific dark that New Year's Eve produces on the Maine coast, the cold absolute, the harbor, doing its January preparatory things, the house lit behind them, and Theo asleep inside under the navigation chart book's shelf and the stone-sorted arrangements. She stood with Stellan at the headland bench and looked at the harbor. "Good year," he said. "Very. Better than last year." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things anymore. "Different," she said. "Last year was reconstruction. This year was use." He looked at her. "And next year?" She thought about the interval Theo's question had opened, about the south wing and its rooms, about what buildings were for when the foundation was sound. "Building," she said. He took her hand. Below the headland, the harbor ran in its channels deep and consistent, shaped by decades of motion into something reliable, something you could navigate by, something that pointed reliably toward wherever you were trying to go if you knew how to read the evidence it offered. The new year came in with the cold and the dark and the certainty of the water. She was ready.